Welcome to Dark Horror Diaries, my friend. Before the show starts, do write below where are you from. Let's go. Moving into a new apartment should feel like a fresh start, but this place already had a history before I arrived. The building was old, at least 70 years, maybe more. The walls were cracked like a spiderweb stretched too thin, and the wooden floors groaned under my weight no matter how carefully I stepped. I wasn't picky though. As a college student juggling 2 jobs and an ever-mounting pile of debt, I took what I could afford. This was it. 4th floor, end of the hall, directly across from the stairwell. The rent was suspiciously low, but I convinced myself it was just a lucky break. The hallway smelled like mildew, and the lighting flickered every few seconds, but the apartment itself wasn't terrible. Small but livable. 1 bedroom, a cramped kitchenette, and a single window overlooking the back alley. I spent the first evening unpacking, trying to make the place feel like mine. I hung a few posters, stacked my books along the windowsill, and set up my tiny desk near the door. At some point, I noticed the air vents. Wider than they needed to be, with rusted grates that looked easily removable. I shivered but shook it off. Old buildings had quirks. The first night was uneventful, aside from the noise. A scuttling behind the walls like something small moving around. Rats, I assumed. Maybe even squirrels. I pulled the blanket over my head and tried not to think about it. The sounds came and went in little bursts. Scratching, a faint rustling, and once what I thought might have been a breath. My mind made it bigger than it was. The wind, I told myself. It was always just the wind. Classes kept me busy the next few days, but every night the noises returned. Sometimes they were worse, like something shifting inside the walls. I started sleeping with music playing to drown it out. I even mentioned it to my landlord, Mr. Calloway, a greasy man with a permanent sweat stain on his collar. He barely looked up from his paperwork when he muttered, probably just the pipes settling. By the end of the week, I found something new. Something that made my stomach twist. A hole, no bigger than a dime, near the base of my bedroom wall. It hadn't been there before. At first, I thought I'd just never noticed it, but when I bent down for a closer look, I realized the edges were rough, like someone had picked at it with their fingernails. It was small but deep. Something about it made me uneasy. That night, I couldn't stop looking at the hole. I taped over it, but even then, I felt aware of it, like an itch I couldn't scratch. I told myself I was being ridiculous. There was no reason to feel watched. And yet, as I lay in bed, I swore I could hear it again. Breathing. Slow, deliberate. The tape crinkled slightly, as if someone were pressing against it from the other side. I didn't sleep. By morning, the tape was gone. I stared at the hole, my pulse pounding in my ears. I had taped it up before bed. I was sure of it. Now the adhesive strips lay curled on the floor, like something had peeled them away in the night. I crouched down, my breath shallow, and leaned in. The hole was darker than it should have been, like it tunneled further than the thickness of the wall. My skin prickled. I had 2 choices, ignore it or confront it. Confronting meant what? Sticking my finger inside, peering through. I hesitated for a long time before grabbing my phone and flipping on the flashlight. I aimed the beam into the hole, angling it to see whatever was on the other side. Nothing. Just drywall and darkness. Still, my nerves wouldn't settle. I spent the afternoon in class, barely paying attention. My mind kept drifting back to that hole. When I got home, I inspected every inch of my bedroom wall. No other holes, just the one. But I wasn't taking any chances. That night, I set up my phone on my desk, angled toward the hole, and hit record. It wasn't a fancy setup. Just a basic recording, no night vision or anything. But if something moved, I'd know. The next morning, I hesitated before checking the footage. My stomach was in knots. I wasn't even sure what I expected to see. A mouse? Some trick of the light. With a deep breath, I pressed play. At first, it was just me, shifting in bed, the dull hum of the city outside. The room was still. Then, at around 3:14 a.m., something changed. The hole. Something moved behind it. A shadow. A shift in the darkness. Then, unmistakably, I dropped my phone. It clattered against the floor, the screen still glowing. My whole body went rigid, a cold, creeping dread working its way through my spine. Someone had been watching me. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my phone and stormed to the landlord's office. Mr. Calloway barely glanced up from his crossword puzzle. He snorted. Come on, kid. There's no space in those walls big enough for someone to fit. I have video, I snapped. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his chin, still looking amused. Show me. I fumbled with my phone, pulled up the video, and shoved it in front of him. He watched, his face unreadable. When the moment came, the eye in the hole, his expression barely changed. He handed my phone back. Shadows, he said, tricks of the light. I clenched my jaw. You're seriously going to ignore this? Calloway sighed and leaned forward. Look, he said, voice low. This is an old building. It creaks, it settles, and yeah, sometimes weird stuff happens. But no one's living in your walls, all right? If you've got rats, I'll call an exterminator. Otherwise, it's your imagination. I wanted to argue, but something in his tone made me pause. He wasn't dismissing me out of laziness. He was avoiding something. I left his office more unsettled than before. That night, I double-checked the hole, but it was the same as before. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that image burned into my brain. The eye, the slow, unblinking stare. And the worst part, I had no idea how long it had been watching. I didn't sleep. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing. Whoever or whatever it was, staring at me through the hole. My skin crawled at the thought of it, the way it had been there, watching in the dark, unseen until I caught it. How many nights had I been oblivious? How many times had I changed my clothes, sat on my bed, existed in this apartment, thinking I was alone? By sunrise, I had made a decision. If Calloway wouldn't take me seriously, I'd figure this out myself. The first step was understanding the building. I spent the morning at the city records office, digging through old blueprints. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Just a standard apartment layout, identical units stacked one over the other. But then I noticed something, a gap. A narrow, unexplained void between the units on my floor and the ones below. A space that didn't appear to have any purpose. No pipes, no ducts, just empty. A crawl space. I stared at the blueprints, my pulse picking up. That meant there was space behind my walls. Space where someone real, could be. My stomach twisted. I had to know for sure. That night, I armed myself with the basics. A flashlight, a hammer, and a box cutter. I stood in front of the hole in my wall, breathing hard. My hands were sweaty. I told myself I was being stupid, that I should call someone. But who? The cops? They'd laugh me off the phone. No, I had to see for myself. I pressed my fingers to the drywall right near the hole. It felt thin, weaker than I expected. Swallowing my fear, I took the hammer and struck. The sound was deafening in the small room. The first hit barely made a dent, but the second cracked the surface. On the third, my hammer punched through entirely. A small, jagged hole. And then, something shifted. Not in my apartment. Behind the wall. I froze. My breath hitched. The sound had been slight, but it was there. A rustling. A scrape. Someone, or something, was moving. I swallowed hard and grabbed my flashlight. Slowly, I brought it up to the hole and aimed the beam inside. The light cut through the dust, revealing a narrow space just wide enough for a person to slip through. The walls were old, the wooden beams stripped bare. Then I saw them, scattered along the floor. Wrappers, old, crumpled food wrappers, a dirty blanket, a half-empty bottle of water, and something else. Polaroids, dozens of them, arranged in a neat little row along the crawlspace floor. My stomach lurched as I picked one up. The image was faded, but I knew what it was before I even saw the details. My apartment, my bed, and me, sleeping. The photos spanned weeks. Different angles, different nights. Some were close-ups, inches from my face. My hands shook as I flipped through them. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching me for God knows how long. And then, a whisper. Not loud, not clear, but it was there, drifting from deeper in the crawl space. My heart slammed into my ribs. I wasn't alone. I dropped the Polaroids. My body felt frozen, locked in place by something more primal than fear. The whisper had been real. It wasn't my imagination. Someone was there, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, just past the edge of the broken wall. I should have run. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to get out. But instead, I did something incredibly, impossibly stupid. I spoke. "Who's there?" My voice barely made it past my lips. It came out weak, hoarse, like I was afraid of making too much noise. Maybe I was. Silence. Then, movement. A shuffle of fabric. The unmistakable sound of skin brushing against wood. My grip tightened on the flashlight as I slowly aimed it deeper into the crawl space. The light wobbled from my shaking hands, sweeping over the filth-streaked floor, the tangle of blankets, the empty food wrappers. And then, a face. For a split second, I saw him. A gaunt, pale face peeking around the corner, just beyond the beam of my flashlight. His eyes were wide and unblinking, pupils dilated to black pinpricks. His lips were cracked dry. Greasy hair clung to his forehead. And then, he moved. I didn't think. I scrambled backward, dropping the flashlight as I fell hard on my hands. The room tilted as my brain caught up to what I had just seen. There was a man living inside my walls. I pushed myself to my feet, nearly tripping over my own panic. My hands fumbled for my phone. I needed to call the police. Now. But as I unlocked it, the screen lit up with a notification. "Unknown number. You shouldn't have done that." I gasped, nearly dropping the phone. My hand shook as I stared at the message. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air thick and suffocating. My breathing was too loud, my pulse hammering against my ribs like it wanted out. Then, another sound. A slow creak. I turned, and my stomach twisted into a knot. The bedroom closet. The door was open. Just an inch. But it had been closed when I entered the room. I wasn't alone. With a burst of adrenaline, I bolted for the front door. My fingers fumbled with the lock as I yanked it open and stumbled into the hallway. The lights flickered above me, buzzing like dying flies. I ran. Down the hall, down the stairs, past the rows of numbered doors. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping in the cold night air. I dialed 911 with trembling hands. "There's someone in my apartment," I choked out. "He's been living in my walls." The dispatcher asked me to stay on the line. I could barely focus, my body still caught between terror and disbelief. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights washing the street in red and blue. I led them back upstairs, my legs weak beneath me. But when we reached my apartment, the door was closed. The hole in the wall, gone. The Polaroids, gone. The crawl space, sealed shut as if it had never been there. And my closet, empty. One of the officers looked at me like I was crazy. The other just sighed. "Miss, are you sure you weren't dreaming?" I almost laughed. Hysterical, bitter laughter. But then I saw it. Just above my bed, near the vent. A fresh hole. And behind it, the glint of an eye. I didn't go back inside. The police didn't believe me. They checked the apartment, found nothing, and left me standing there, shaken and furious. "File a report in the morning," one of them had said, like I had imagined the whole thing. Like I was some paranoid woman who had gotten spooked by shadows. But I knew what I saw. I booked a cheap motel that night. The kind where the sheets smelled like bleach, and the TV only played static. I locked the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and sat on the bed with my back against the wall. My phone sat in my lap, screen glowing in the dark. I kept scrolling through my messages, rereading that single text. "You shouldn't have done that." I didn't reply. I didn't even want to breathe too loudly, like somehow he could still hear me. At some point, exhaustion won. My body shut down, my mind finally slipping into uneasy sleep. I dreamed of walls closing in, of fingers reaching through the cracks, of eyes watching me from the darkness. By morning, I had made my decision. I wasn't staying. I skipped class and went straight to the landlord's office. Calloway was at his desk, coffee in one hand, crossword puzzle in the other. When he saw me, he sighed like he'd been expecting this. "I want out of my lease," I said, voice steady. "I don't care about penalties. I'm leaving." He set his coffee down. "That bad, huh?" My stomach twisted. He wasn't surprised. Not even a little. "You knew," I said slowly, "didn't you?" Calloway rubbed his temples, then leaned forward. "Listen," he muttered. "I don't know what you think you saw, but people hear things in old buildings. They get ideas." I slammed my hands on his desk. "There was a man living in my walls," I hissed. "I saw him. I have proof." He didn't flinch. "Do you?" My breath caught. The Polaroids were gone. The hole was patched. The crawl space, if it had ever existed, was sealed. Calloway let the silence stretch before exhaling. "This building is complicated," he said. "You're not the first to complain about noises, but every time someone makes a fuss, well, the walls seem to fix themselves." A chill ran down my spine. "I'll let you break the lease," he continued. "No fees, no questions." He slid a document toward me. "Just sign." I should have been relieved. I should have grabbed the pen and never looked back. But something gnawed at me. "What happened to the last tenant?" I asked. Calloway's face darkened. "She left," he said. "Just like you should." I wanted to push to demand answers, but my skin prickled with something worse than fear. A warning. I signed the papers. By nightfall, I was back at my apartment, shoving clothes into a suitcase. I didn't care about packing neatly. I just wanted out. My hands shook as I zipped the bag, my ears straining for the smallest sound. Then, I heard it. Not from the walls, not from the vents, from the closet. A whisper. Not words. Just breathe. Long, slow, waiting. I turned, my whole body locking up. The closet door was open again. Just an inch. Just enough for someone to watch. I took a step back. Then another. My suitcase handle was slick in my grip. I didn't blink. I didn't breathe. Then, the door creaked. And something moved inside. I didn't think. I ran. The suitcase hit the floor with a thud, but I didn't stop. I bolted for the door, fingers fumbling at the lock, my breath coming too fast, too shallow. Behind me, the closet door groaned wider, hinges protesting against years of disuse. Then, footsteps. Not heavy. Not rushed. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from inside the closet. I yanked the door open and stumbled into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly, I nearly dropped my phone as I dialed 911. A woman's voice answered, calm and detached. 911, what's your emergency? There's. My voice cracked. I turned back toward the door, half expecting it to open. There's someone in my apartment. He's been watching me, living in my walls. A pause. Then, are you in a safe location? No. Yes, but he's still inside. Stay on the line. Officers are en route. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, my pulse hammering in my ears. The hallway was empty, eerily quiet. I backed away from my door, watching it, waiting for it to burst open. Then, a sound. Not from inside my apartment. From above. I tilted my head up, breath catching in my throat. The air vent. Something shifted behind the metal slats. A soft scrape. A whisper of movement. My stomach dropped. The walls weren't the only way in. I turned and ran, flying down the stairwell 2 at a time, my heartbeat an earthquake in my chest. I didn't stop until I burst onto the street, gasping in the cold air. Minutes stretched into eternity before the flashing lights appeared. 2 officers stepped out, calm, unconcerned. One of them, a younger guy with tired eyes, took my statement while the other disappeared into the building. "Are you sure he was inside?" the young officer asked. I almost laughed. "Yes, I'm sure. He was in my walls. I have proof." I reached for my phone, ready to show him the footage. But when I opened the camera app, the video was gone. Every recording from the past 2 nights. Every shred of evidence. I stared at the empty screen, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Had I deleted them by accident? No, I would have remembered. The other officer returned a few minutes later, shaking his head. "Apartment's clear," he said. "No signs of forced entry." I swallowed hard. "Did you check the vents?" The officer hesitated. "Ma'am, there's no way someone could fit in those. They're too narrow." I wanted to scream. The officers gave me the usual speech. File a report, stay somewhere else if I didn't feel safe. As if I needed to be told that. I was never setting foot in that apartment again. The next morning, I went back with a moving company, grabbed my essentials, and left. I didn't check the closet. I didn't check the walls. I didn't want to know. By the end of the week, I was in a new apartment, one with thick concrete walls and no vents large enough to crawl through. I slept with the lights on for weeks. I tried to move on, tried to forget. Then, one night, my phone buzzed. A single message, no number, No name. Just a picture. A Polaroid. Taken through a hole in the wall. Of me. Sleeping. This happened 3 years ago, and I still don't have an explanation for it. I had just moved into a cheap studio apartment in an old building. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The place had character. Creaky wooden floors, weird old pipes, and a landlord who was just sketchy enough to make me wonder if I'd made a mistake. The first weird thing happened my first night there. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a faint scratching sound. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside my closet wall. I figured it was mice or something and tried to ignore it. But every night, like clockwork, the scratching came back. Always faint, always deliberate. One night, curiosity got the best of me. I knocked on the wall, and something knocked back. I nearly pissed myself. But instead of running, I did the dumbest thing imaginable. I started tapping in patterns, and it copied me. Now I was fully convinced I was dealing with a squatter. I contacted my landlord, who brushed me off, saying, "That unit's been sealed for years. No one's in there." I asked him what he meant, but he just told me to mind my business. So of course I didn't. That weekend, I bought some basic tools and started prying at the wooden panels inside the closet. It took hours, but eventually a section came loose. Behind it, a dark, narrow passageway leading into the apartment next door. Only, there was no apartment next door. According to the building's layout, my unit was supposed to be the last one on this floor. But here was this hidden space that no one acknowledged. I should have left. I should have sealed it back up and forgotten about it. Instead, I crawled through. The space was dusty, cramped, and smelled off. Like old wood and something rotting. My phone flashlight barely cut through the darkness, but as I moved further in, I started seeing things. A small mattress, rotten food containers, piles of clothes that didn't look that old. Someone had been living here. Then I saw the Polaroids. Scattered on the floor were dozens of them. Pictures of people sleeping. Close-ups of their faces, their hands, their feet sticking out from under blankets. My stomach dropped. The walls of the hidden space were covered in more of them, some so old they were yellowing. And then I saw the newest one. It was me, sleeping in my new apartment, from the night before. I don't remember running back through the tunnel, but I do remember sealing that wall up so fast I split my fingers open. I moved out the next day. Didn't even wait for my lease to end. I still don't know who was in there. The landlord refused to talk about it, and when I checked the building records, there was never supposed to be another unit there. But sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like someone's watching me. And I swear I hear scratching. I never picked up hitchhikers. That was one of those unspoken rules in life, like locking your doors at night or not taking candy from a stranger. But on that empty stretch of highway in the dead of night, something about the man standing at the roadside made me hesitate. I was driving home from a long shift at the hospital. 12 hours of chaos in the air, and my brain was fried. My name's Daniel Carter, and I work as a trauma nurse. A job that's equal parts adrenaline and exhaustion. Maybe that's why I pulled over. Maybe I was too tired to think straight. Or maybe it was the way he stood there, shoulders hunched, hands stuffed into the pockets of his weathered jacket, staring at the ground like he had nowhere left to go. I cracked the window an inch. "Need a ride?" The man lifted his head, and for the first time I saw his face. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with sharp cheekbones and dark, restless eyes that flicked over my car, the road, the trees. He didn't speak, just nodded. Something about him put me on edge, but I ignored it. The highway stretched for miles with nothing but thick woods on either side. If I left him out here, who knew what would happen? "Get in," I said, unlocking the door. He slid into the passenger's seat without a word. As I pulled back onto the road, I noticed his hands were shaking. He kept looking in the side mirror, like he was expecting someone to be following us. Silence filled the car, thick and uncomfortable. I cleared my throat. "Where you headed?" The man turned his head slightly, eyes still fixed on the mirror. Then, finally, in a low voice, he said, "Just drive." I gripped the wheel tighter. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, like he was barely holding something together. Just drive, I repeated, trying to keep my tone light. That's not much of a destination. He didn't answer. Instead, he shifted in his seat, adjusting his jacket as if he was concealing something underneath. A knife? A gun? I forced myself to focus on the road, but my pulse had kicked up a notch. For a long stretch, the only sound was the hum of the tires against the pavement. I stole glances at him out of the corner of my eye. He was tense, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his thigh. His gaze kept flicking to the rearview mirror. Something was wrong. Listen, I said, my voice measured. If you're in trouble, I need to know. I don't want any problems. He exhaled slowly, then turned to look at me for the first time since getting in the car. There's a man following me, he said. He was back there in the woods. He's coming. A shiver worked its way up my spine. What do you mean, coming? He pointed to the mirror. Don't stop, no matter what. My mouth went dry. I wanted to tell him he was being paranoid, but something about his expression, pure, unfiltered fear, kept me from arguing. I glanced at the mirror. The road behind us was dark and empty. Nothing but trees and black asphalt stretching into the night. And then, just as I was about to tell him there was no one there, I saw it. A figure, emerging from the trees. He stepped onto the highway, walking fast. No, running. A chill ran through me. My passenger let out a shaky breath. Now you see him, he murmured. I pressed my foot harder on the gas. The engine growled as I pushed the speed limit, my hands clammy on the wheel. The figure behind us was growing smaller, swallowed by the darkness, but that did nothing to ease the tension coiling in my gut. Who is he? I asked. The man in my passenger seat. My unwanted hitchhiker. Rubbed his hands together, his knee bouncing. He's a killer, he muttered, and he's not going to stop. I swallowed hard. A killer? He turned his head, eyes dark and unreadable. Yeah, and if you stop this car, we're both dead. 100 thoughts tumbled through my head at once. Was this guy lying? Was this some kind of setup? My instincts screamed at me to pull over, to kick him out before things got worse. But I couldn't shake the way he kept looking over his shoulder, the raw fear in his voice. The headlights carved through the empty road, but I suddenly felt like we weren't alone, like something was closing in. You need to tell me everything. Now. My voice came out sharper than I intended. The man exhaled, raking a hand through his short, dark hair. He's been hunting people along this road for years. Nobody ever catches him. No bodies, no clues. Just people disappearing. He looked at me then, his eyes unreadable. And tonight, he almost got me. A chill slid down my spine. I glanced at the mirror again. The road was empty now, but my gut told me we weren't safe. How do you know he's still coming? I asked. The man turned his head slowly toward me. Because I shot him, he said, and he got back up. My stomach twisted. You shot him? My voice came out hoarse like I had swallowed gravel. The hitchhiker didn't flinch. Twice, chest and shoulder. His fingers curled into fists. It didn't stop him. I gritted my teeth, keeping my eyes on the road. My first instinct was to call him a liar. People didn't just shrug off gunshot wounds like mosquito bites. But something about the way he said it, flat, certain, made my skin crawl. How do you know he's after you? A humorless chuckle escaped him. Because he was still walking toward me when I ran. I exhaled through my nose, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. The gas gauge hovered just above empty. If we didn't stop soon, the car would make the decision for us. We need to call the police. No. His voice was sharp. Too sharp. He's smart. He won't get caught. He never does. A nasty thought wormed into my brain. What if this guy wasn't the victim? What if he was the danger sitting right next to me? I measured my next words carefully. Then what's your plan? Just drive until we run out of road? His knee bounced. We don't stop. We find somewhere safe. I glanced at him, searching for cracks in his story. And where exactly is safe? Before he could answer, a loud thud slammed against the back of the car. The tires skidded as I swerved, my pulse hammering. What the... Another thud. Louder this time. The car lurched. My breath hitched. I didn't dare look at the mirror. I didn't want to see. But I did. And there he was, clinging to the trunk. The man who was supposed to be dead. The car swayed as I struggled to keep it steady, my pulse hammering in my ears. The man clinging to the trunk was barely visible in the darkness, but I saw the glint of something in his hand. A knife. "Drive faster," the hitchhiker shouted, bracing himself against the dashboard. I'm already flooring it. My voice cracked as I glanced at the speedometer. 85, 90. The road was a blur, trees whipping past in dark smudges. The figure behind us didn't budge. His grip was inhumanly strong, his body hunched over like some nightmare creature, eyes locked onto me in the rearview mirror. Then, he moved. I barely had time to react before he hoisted himself up onto the roof of the car. The whole frame shuddered beneath his weight. My passenger cursed under his breath. His hands shot inside his jacket, pulling out something small and dark. Another gun. I didn't know what shocked me more. The fact that he had it, or the way he held it like second nature. "Who the hell are you?" I choked out. Later, he snapped. He rolled down the window, bracing himself against the wind. A hollow boom exploded through the car as he fired a shot straight up. A thud, a grunt, then nothing. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then the windshield cracked. A jagged web of fractures spread from the center. The hitchhiker's face paled. "He's still up there." Another crack. A small hole formed just above my head. He was stabbing through the glass. I let out a shaky breath, knuckles white on the wheel. "Tell me you have a plan." The hitchhiker's jaw tightened. "I do." He chambered another round. "But you're not gonna like it." The car shuddered under the weight of the man above us, his knife stabbing through the windshield in quick, deliberate strikes. Another crack splintered through the glass, dangerously close to my face. "Whatever your plan is, do it now," I shouted, gripping the wheel so hard my fingers ached. The hitchhiker didn't hesitate. He reached across me, yanked the wheel hard to the right. The car screeched, tires skidding as we veered off the road. My stomach lurched as we plowed through the trees, branches scraping against the sides like clawing fingers. The front bumper slammed into something solid, and the car jerked to a violent stop. My head snapped forward, the seatbelt locking just in time. The weight from the roof disappeared. A dull thump followed. He had been thrown off. Everything was silent except for the ticking of the overheated engine and my own ragged breathing. The hitchhiker was already moving, gun raised as he shoved open the door. I fumbled with my seatbelt, instincts screaming at me to run, to move, to do something. Then, from behind the car, footsteps, slow, deliberate. He was still alive. A sickening groan came from the darkness, followed by the crunch of boots on gravel. The hitchhiker took aim, stepping forward. "Stay behind me," he ordered. I didn't argue. The figure staggered into view. His silhouette was twisted, unnatural, one arm hanging at an odd angle. But his grip on the knife never loosened. The hitchhiker didn't hesitate. He fired. One shot, then another. The figure jerked back, but didn't fall. One more shot. This time, the man crumpled, collapsing to the ground in a heap. Silence. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then the hitchhiker exhaled, lowering the gun. "It's over." I stared at him, my mind still catching up. My hands trembled. "Who are you?" He turned to me, eyes sharp, calculating. Then, finally, he sighed. "Detective Ryan Graves, undercover." My stomach twisted. "You're a cop." He nodded, slipping the gun back into his jacket. He was a serial killer. Been hunting him for years, but he always found the victims first. I looked down at the crumpled body, my breath unsteady. "And tonight?" His jaw tightened. "Tonight, you picked up the wrong hitchhiker." I let out a shaky laugh. Part relief, part disbelief. Then the body twitched. My heart stopped. The hitchhiker. Detective Graves. Whirled around, gun raised again. The man on the ground lifted his head, blood smeared across his face. And he smiled. The last thing I heard was the echo of another gunshot. Then, darkness. I've always suffered with insomnia. Even from a young age, like 9 or 12, it's always plagued me. I usually just stay up doing meditative things until I fall asleep. That's before I got my car and driver's license. Now I just take long drives to the rural parts of my county where the woods and farmland are. No one is ever out on the road, so it's very peaceful. With that being said, it doesn't mean I'm alone on those dirt roads. The things I've seen have both horrified and intrigued me. I'll share a few experiences I have had on these stretches of lonely road. The figure. During one of my late-night drives, I went further than I usually do. The road gets older and more overgrown in those parts. It basically leads to a very ancient forest with nothing but tire marks as a road. I'm driving, and all of a sudden I catch something in my headlights. A tall humanoid figure covered up by the bushes, facing a tree with its arms by its side, Blair Witch style. I've seen stuff like this before, so I just take a mental note of it and continue on exploring. For context, the things you encounter out here at night aren't necessarily hostile. They won't mess with you if you don't mess with them. I didn't see that particular figure for the rest of the night, and I didn't get a good look at them because of the bushes covering them. All I knew at the time is that they were tall as shit. I'm talking making basketball players look scrawny. Other than its freakish height, the proportions were all out of whack. One shoulder was huge and beefy, but had a twig-like arm attached to it, and the other shoulder was thin, but had a bodybuilder arm at the end of it. That night was pretty uneventful, so I decided to head back early and try to sleep. The next night was much more interesting. As per usual, I couldn't sleep, so I hopped on my car and drove to the rural dirt roads. I decided to head back into those deep woods to see if I could see that weird tall figure again. I'm driving slowly down this forest for 30 minutes, radio off, dead silent woods, and I don't see a thing. Which is pretty uncommon not to see something weird. I closed my eyes and sighed, running my fingers through my hair. When I opened them, the figure was there. Misshapen body, arms at its sides, facing the opposite direction. It was directly in front of my headlights, and I got a better look at it. This thing was wearing a filthy dark green trench coat with some torn brown jeans and boots splattered with mud. The figure's legs were also misshapen and uneven. One leg was swollen and was as thick as a car tire, while the other leg was literally just skin and bones. The hair on the back of its head waxed patchy and looked like a failed buzz cut. It stretched out its skinny arm like it was getting ready to point at something to the side. The figure's hands made finger scissors that opened and closed. I sat there, completely in shock. My heart sank with the realization it was mocking me. A while back in school, I got bullied by this asshole who called me Snip Snip and would constantly make the same scissoring motion with his fingers. He called me this because, well, I'm a trans girl. I grunted in anger and gestured for this thing to move to the side. Its back was facing me, so it didn't see. I had serious thoughts of running this thing over, but I remembered. If I don't mess with them, they won't harm me. I just drove around it and didn't dare look in the rearview mirror to see its face. It was facing backwards for a reason. I still see it from time to time, and it always is mocking me with gestures, mimicking something painful from my past. Sign language to mock my sibling who went deaf from an infection, waving a fist around violently to reference my physical ex, the gesture of holding a cigarette to make fun of my aunt who died of lung cancer, etc. This thing really just pisses me off more than anything. Its mutated ass body is kind of unnerving though. The Eater. The Eater is a pretty common one to see on those roads at night. My first encounter with it was just like all the other times I see this thing. It's semi-humanoid with pitch black skin and a very obese frame. It walks on all fours like a gorilla. It has tiny claws for hands. Its face is like a leech with dead, glazed over eyes on the sides of its neck, and the gross thing has a long tongue. I'll see it early on in my drives. The Eater is usually crouched over a corpse of a dead animal with a chunk of the carcass's meat in its tiny hands. The Eater just licks the meat with that huge tongue. It just laps up gore and blood. I don't think it hunts, it's more of a scavenger. The Eater is very docile and gets kind of curious when I pass by. It doesn't get too close though. Sometimes I'll throw some leftover dinner I have into the tall grasses for it. I still wouldn't touch it if you paid me. Live and let live is what I've learned in these places. Skinless. Skinless is one of the more dangerous things out in those woods. Whenever I see her, I immediately turn around and go straight home. She's a skinless woman, hence the name, in a white dress soaked in blood. Her flayed body is always bleeding, and she has a large butcher's knife clenched in her hand. She appears in the tall grass and will stumble towards your car slowly. She's slow, but she will catch up eventually. Skinless will stand by your driver's side window and tap her knife against the glass. She'll ask you if she's beautiful in a voice that echoes through your soul. It sounds like a much more demonic voice is speaking under hers. If you lock eyes with Skinless, you'll have the uncontrollable urge to gag or throw up. If you do throw up or gag, she'll violently smash your window and try to flay your skin off. I've only had this happen once, and I managed to speed off before she could shatter the window. She kept screaming about how she will skin me alive. If you do basically anything, she'll kill you. I haven't really bothered to try saying yes because it's nearly impossible with the crippling fear and that sick feeling you get in your stomach. Your best option is to just drive away before she catches up. Once you get out of those grasses and to civilization, you're pretty much fine. I may write about my first encounter with Skinless in a separate post. If you see her in the distance, just turn around and don't look back. Headlights. This is by far the most dangerous creature I've encountered on my drives. If you see this thing, you better go as fast as you can in the other direction and pray to every single deity you know. I almost stopped going on drives after I met this thing. Last month, I was on a drive that was eerily calm. There was nothing. No wind, no rustling, not even any strange apparitions. I thought it was strange and slowed down slightly while driving, my eyes darting to every corner of the tall grass and the forest. There was absolutely nothing. Skinless usually scares off some other entities and animals, but she only appears once every couple of weeks. This was different. This continued until I reached an old farm at the edge of the tall grass. I usually pull to a crawl and look at the barn. Sometimes there are shadows or a strange ram-like creature that walks by the windows. Nothing walked by the windows. Strangely, the absence of any horrible monster was making me afraid. That's when I saw it. Two huge headlights stabbing my eyes like two suns. I heard the rumbling sputter of a damaged engine. In front of me was a 1940s-style truck painted completely black. A sense of impending death fell over me like a macabre blanket, and I quickly fumbled with a stick shift to put my car in reverse. I nearly floored it as a scream erupted from inside the truck. The scream was not of this world. It ripped all the joy I had in my heart out and into the starless night. Whatever was driving that thing was pure evil. It was an ancient force of malice like the boogeyman or the devil. The truck engine growled, and it peeled after me while I was in reverse. I didn't have time to turn around, or else it would cut me off and crash into me. Eventually, I reached a clearing where I could turn around by putting all my weight into turning the steering wheel. I zoomed down the forgotten stretches of road with the truck in hot pursuit. My radio came to life with a piercing roar of static. It played an audio that still haunts me to this day. A woman was screaming in pure fear, a deep, primal howl of pure dread. In the background of her screams was that old "Here Comes the Boogeyman" song. A masculine voice could also be heard mumbling as there was a slicing sound, and the woman's screams somehow got louder. I peered into the rear view again to see another horrible thing. Two huge pale arms that were 6 feet long coming out from beneath the black truck. The hands balled into fists and tried to slam on my rear window, but I quickly swerved, almost hitting a tree. These pale arms coming from the truck galloped along the ground, helping it gain speed. I soared out of the old roads and pulled onto a modern street and slammed the brakes at a gas station. As I caught my breath and refueled from that horrifying experience, I noticed my radio was spewing a choppy static that sounded like a dying moan. Yeah, I haven't been out driving for a while after. I'm thinking I'm going to start taking a different route. If you do find yourself there, remember to chuck some meat in the field, look out for Skinless, and don't even think about heading to that barn. There's something about driving at night that makes a man feel both invincible and invisible. The highway stretches ahead like a tunnel into nowhere, and the world outside the truck cab feels unreal, like a painting that only exists because I'm looking at it. I've been driving for nearly 10 hours straight, hauling freight across Texas, and the monotony of the road has started to sink into my bones when the sign for a rest stop appears. A gas station, a couple of vending machines, a lot big enough for a few semis. I don't think twice. I pull in, kill the engine, and let the silence settle around me. There's only one other car in the lot, a black sedan parked at the far end with its headlights off. It's an older model, something from the early 2000s, with windows tinted dark enough that I can't see inside. I tell myself it's nothing. Maybe someone else just needed to rest, same as me. Still, I don't like it. Feels too still, like it's waiting. I lock the doors before reclining my seat, shifting to get comfortable. The truck's engine ticks as it cools. A glance at my phone tells me it's past midnight. I close my eyes and try to let sleep take me. It doesn't. The air feels thick, pressing against my skin like a warning. I tell myself it's the exhaustion playing tricks, but the feeling doesn't fade. Minutes pass. Then a sound, so soft I almost don't hear it. A tap, just one. I keep my eyes shut. Another tap, closer this time. I force myself to stay still, my breathing even. The cab feels smaller suddenly, the locked door's a thin barrier between me and whatever's outside. I shift, just enough to glance at the side mirror. The sedan is no longer parked at the far end of the lot. It's behind my truck now. Its engine is still off, but it's there, and that means someone moved it. My pulse kicks up. I scan the mirror for movement. Then I see it. A figure just at the edge of the glass, creeping toward my truck. Slow, deliberate. A shadow where a person should be. The tapping starts again, this time on the passenger side window. Light testing. Like someone checking to see if I'll wake up. I don't move. I don't breathe. I just wait. The tapping stops. For a moment, all I hear is the hum of the highway in the distance and the faint rustling of the wind. I'm still, my hand gripping the knife I keep in the console. It feels heavy in my palm, almost too heavy, like I'm already waiting to use it. I stare at the rearview mirror, watching the shadow of the figure move around my truck, circling it, almost in a slow dance. I force myself not to look directly at the windows to keep my breathing steady, but the adrenaline is already starting to pour into my veins. The figure doesn't come closer. It seems to be lingering just out of sight, but I can hear the occasional scrape of shoes against gravel, the subtle noise of movement that shouldn't be there. I don't want to move, don't want to give away that I'm awake, but I can't stop myself from shifting slightly in my seat. I need to know where the person is. I glance to my left mirror again. The shadow is right there, now just a few feet from the door. The figure doesn't appear to be in a hurry. No sense of urgency. I can't make out any features, just the shape of a person, tall, slender, and wearing something dark. Too dark. There's something off about the way the figure moves. No quick jerks, no nervous twitches, just smooth, deliberate steps. It's as if they know I'm here, waiting for me to make a mistake. I stare at the mirror, trying to will myself to stay calm, but the seconds stretch into eternity. What do they want? The rest stop is nearly deserted. There's nothing here but a few trucks and that sedan. My fingers itch to reach for the door lock, but I resist. If I do that, if I move too much, it'll be obvious that I'm awake, and I don't want them to know that. It's been long enough now that I can't tell if the figure is still there or if I'm just imagining it. My heart thunders in my chest, and I force myself to breathe. In and out, in and out. But then, just as I'm about to think it's safe to close my eyes again, there's a soft thud against the door, followed by a light tap on the window. It's almost too gentle, but it feels like a challenge. I don't know what to do. What am I supposed to do when a stranger knocks on my window in the middle of the night like this? The thought of opening the door, of engaging with whoever this is, feels impossible. My mind races for a solution, but none comes. Instead, I focus on the knife in my hand, its cold steel reflecting the dim light from the overhead bulb. I don't make a sound, don't move a muscle. The silence hangs thick again, but this time it's different. I can feel it now. Someone is standing just outside, watching me, watching for a sign, a movement, a mistake. I sit frozen, my fingers wrapped tight around the knife's handle. My pulse slams against my ribs. Seconds crawl by, stretching into something unnatural. I listen. Nothing. The silence is worse than the tapping. It's deliberate. Whoever is out there is waiting, watching, gauging whether or not I'll react. I shift my eyes to the mirror. The figure is gone. Just like that. The parking lot is empty except for the black sedan and my truck. I swallow, my throat dry. The logical part of my brain tells me the person walked away, but I don't buy it. They didn't just disappear. They're somewhere out there, hiding in the dark. I exhale slowly, trying to calm myself. Maybe I should turn the truck back on and get the hell out of here. But a problem remains, my logbook. If I get pulled over for violating my rest hours, I could lose my license. And for what? A stranger acting weird at a rest stop. Still, my gut tells me to move. Screw the rules. I reach toward the ignition. Then I hear it. A sound so faint I almost miss it. Creak. Not from outside. Not from the sedan. From the back of my truck. A fresh wave of fear rolls through me. I stare at the small window separating the cab from the trailer. It's dark back there, nothing but a sliver of light from the parking lot. But I know my own truck. That sound. Metal shifting against metal. That was my cargo door. I gripped the knife tighter, my mind scrambling for explanations. I locked the doors. I checked them before shutting my eyes. No one could have gotten in, and yet, I forced myself to move. Slowly, carefully, I lean forward, my muscles coiled. I twist in my seat, angling for a better look at the back window. My breath catches. A shape moves in the darkness. It's inside. I don't think. My body moves on instinct. I lunge forward, slamming my palm against the door handle. But before I can throw it open, something shifts behind me. A presence. Close. Too close. I whip around just as the weight of another body presses against my back. A hand grabs for my throat, fingers cold and bony. I twist, bringing up the knife. And then, in the dim glow of the dashboard light, I see the face. The man is grinning. His grin stretches too wide, teeth yellowed and uneven, like he's been waiting for this moment. His breath is hot against my face, sour with something rotten. I don't think. I react. My hand jerks up, knife flashing in the dim light, but he's fast. Faster than I expect. His grip tightens around my throat, forcing me back against the seat. "Easy now," he whispers. His voice is dry, like paper crumbling. No need to get all worked up. I drive the knife upward, aiming for anything soft. He jerks sideways, the blade missing his ribs by inches. He laughs, low and breathy, like this is nothing but a game. I can't let him pin me. I shove my knee up, ramming it into his stomach. His breath hitches, grip loosening just enough for me to twist free. My elbow slams into his jaw as I scramble for the door handle. I don't care about finesse, don't care about hurting him. I just need out. But before I can pull the handle, I feel it. Something sharp, cold, pressing against my side. A knife. His. The grin never leaves his face. His hand trembles slightly, like he's savoring the moment, stretching it out. "Been waiting on you," he murmurs, pushing the blade just enough to let me feel its edge. "Watched you pick this spot. Knew you'd stop." My stomach turns to ice. This wasn't random. I lash out before he can push the knife deeper. My fist connects with his face. A solid hit. He grunts, grip slipping. I don't hesitate. I slam my head forward, cracking my forehead against his nose. His body jerks back, and that's all I need. I twist the knife in my own grip and plunge it into his side. His eyes go wide. The grin falters. He lets out a sound. Small, surprised. I shove him backward with everything I have, kicking out, sending him sprawling against the passenger seat. His own knife clatters to the floor. I don't wait for him to recover. I wrench open the door and throw myself out into the night. The pavement is rough beneath my hands as I hit the ground, but I don't stop. I scramble to my feet, legs burning, blood pounding in my ears. Behind me, I hear the rustle of movement. He's getting up. I sprint toward the rest stop building. The vending machines cast flickering light against the concrete. There's a payphone near the door, if I can just get to it. A sound cuts through the night. Laughter. I whip around. The man stands beside my truck, one hand pressed to his bleeding side. His knife is back in his grip, and he's smiling again. "You ain't the only one with a knife," he calls, his voice sing-song. "Let's see who's quicker, huh?" I don't answer him. I can't. My chest is heaving, my body screaming at me to run, but my feet won't move. He stands there, smiling, knife in hand, like this is just another game. I force myself to take a step back, then another. My eyes flick to the rest stop building. The payphone. If I can get inside, if I can call for help. He moves. Fast. I barely have time to react before he's sprinting toward me. I turn and bolt, pushing my legs harder than I ever have. The door to the rest stop is just ahead. A few more feet. Pain explodes through my back. I stumble forward, barely catching myself against the cold metal of the vending machine. He tackled me. I twist, throwing my elbow back, but his weight is gone as fast as it landed. He's already stepping away, breathing hard, watching me like he's enjoying this. Blood trickles down my side. Not deep, but enough to burn. Enough to make my hand shake. "Close one," he muses, tilting his head. "But I gotta say, you're real fun to chase." I don't give him the satisfaction of a reply. My hand fumbles behind me, gripping the vending machine's metal edge. I need a weapon. My knife is still in my truck, buried in his side minutes ago. I scan the ground. Nothing but dirt and discarded wrappers. He steps closer. Slow. Deliberate. No more running, he asks. Good. Makes it more personal. My hand lands on something cold and heavy. A thick glass bottle someone left behind, half buried near the vending machine. My fingers close around its neck. The moment he lunges, I swing. The bottle shatters against his face. He lets out a strangled noise, stumbling back, hands flying to his eyes. Blood drips between his fingers. He's still standing, but dazed. I don't hesitate. I charge. I slam into him, driving my full weight forward. He staggers, trips over himself. His arms pinwheel, trying to catch balance. Then he goes down, hard. His head cracks against the pavement. His body jerks, the knife slipping from his fingers. I don't wait to see if he's getting back up. I dive for it, fingers closing around the handle. He groans, rolls onto his side. Too slow. I drive the knife down. It sinks into his chest, deep and unforgiving. His body goes rigid, his mouth parting in a silent gasp. His hands twitch once, twice, then stillness. I stumble back, panting, watching the life drain from his eyes. The smile is gone now, just empty, open-mouthed shock. His fingers twitch one last time before going limp. I drop the knife and stagger toward my truck, vision swimming. My hands shake as I fumble for the door handle. I need to go. The black sedan sits there, motionless. The trunk is slightly open. In the dim glow of the rest stop lights, I see something inside. Something stacked. Papers. I take a step closer, my breath catching. Missing person flyers. Dozens of them. The wind shifts, rustling the edges of the missing person flyers. My stomach knots as I stare into the open trunk. The papers are old, weathered, some yellowed with age. Faces stare back at me, their expressions frozen in grainy black and white. Men, women, even children. I swallow hard. Some of them are recent, names I recognize from gas station bulletin boards and truck stop bathrooms. Others must have been gone for years. Their pictures are blurred, their eyes hollow. I take a step back. My head is spinning, my pulse hammering in my ears. The man on the ground. The one whose blood stains my hands. He wasn't just looking for a random victim. He'd been hunting. And he'd done this before. I turn, forcing myself toward my truck. I need to get out of here. I need to call the cops. My hands fumble for my keys as I yank the door open. Then, movement. A sound so soft I almost don't hear it. A gasp. I freeze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turn my head. He's still alive. The man lies on the pavement, his chest rising in short, uneven bursts. His mouth opens slightly, a thin trickle of blood running from the corner of his lips. His fingers twitch, curling weakly toward the knife still buried in his chest. His eyes find mine, and he smiles. It's weak, barely there, but it's real. You think it's over. His voice is a whisper, rough and broken. You think I was alone. A chill rolls through me. My skin prickles, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I can't move. His smile widens, teeth glinting red. They're still out there. A wet cough rattles his chest. And they know your face now. I take a shaky step back. No, he's messing with me. He's trying to get into my head. But something deep inside me, the part that's kept me alive all these years, knows the truth. He's not lying. The black sedan. The missing person flyers. The way he'd waited for me, knew I'd stop. He wasn't just a killer. He was part of something bigger. My stomach churns. I need to get out of here. Now. I yank my door open and haul myself into the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I jam the key into the ignition. The engine roars to life. The headlights flood the parking lot, throwing long shadows across the pavement. I glance at the rearview mirror, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The man isn't moving anymore. His grin is frozen, his eyes empty. But the trunk of the sedan, it's open wider now. And there's something else inside. Not just the flyers. A radio. The light on it blinks. Someone's been listening. I don't think. I slam the truck into gear, tires screeching against the pavement as I tear out of the rest stop, my heart hammering against my ribs. The black sedan shrinks in the mirror, fading into the darkness behind me. But the feeling stays. That crawling, itching sensation. I'm not alone on this road, and I never will be again. People out here know better. They're wise enough not to go into the woods at night. Bears, of course, are the first thing that might come to mind. Couple of big cats out here, too. But if you ask the right person, they'll tell you you'd be lucky if that's all you come across. They're a superstitious lot. Or they would be if they weren't right. Me, I'm not from the region, and I'd rather not tell you where I'm from. All you need to know is that there's a ratty little shack deep within the woods that I call home. Far from civilization. It was a frigid January night when it happened. When I lost the right to walk amongst men. Me and a couple of the guys, we were camping out. This one guy, Barry I'll call him, was a real rugged sort. He always wanted to prove what a real man he was. Granted, he lived up to his own standards. He hunted, but never wasted a scrap of meat or even bone. He was a hard worker, brawny as hell, but not violent. He drank his whiskey straight, and I think he genuinely liked it that way, and though he drank a lot, his wife and kids loved the guy. Firm, but gentle with his family, the way a real man's man should be. Frankly, he had already become everything he aspired to be. He had nothing to prove, but he still insisted on this trip. It was 4 of us, and as we sat around the roaring campfire in thick winter coats, chugging beer and cracking dumb jokes, the miserable cold felt far away. But once the beer ran out, everybody but Barry was ready to hit the hay. He had decided he wanted to go for a walk at night in the woods in January. I protested, of course, but he was an unshakable sort of man, and so I relented. He had a .357 on his hip and a shotgun strapped across his back, and quite frankly, I wasn't worried. He was built different, as you kids say. I didn't think he'd get lost, and any animal that crossed his path would get blown away real quick. So when we woke up, rising with the winter sun, and Barry hadn't come back, our first assumption was that he'd come back, slept, then gone for a morning walk as well. Maybe to grab more firewood. After a couple hours, he didn't come back, and I went out looking for him. The forest floor was smothered in a thick layer of snow, and as I crunched my way through the silent, hibernating woods, my hand never strayed far from my own handgun. I wish I could tell you that my search bore no fruit, or that Barry had come back on his own while I was out, or that I ran into him in the woods, or, well, he was in pieces. Dried blood had splashed halfway up the trunk of an old pine tree. His left arm had been ripped from his torso, his right missing from the shoulder down, and his stomach had been torn open. I would say Barry had been disemboweled, but whatever killed him had eaten just about everything in his lower abdomen, and only tattered skin and bits of flesh remained. I threw up only natural, given the circumstances. Dizzy, my throat burning, and my heart wrapped in the icy grip of absolute terror, I barreled back the way I came, ready to grab the other 2, hustle into the truck, and get the absolute F out of there. When I got back to the camp, one of the other guys, we'll call him Ted, had gone out looking in another direction. Ted was a heavy-set man, not exactly fit, but he was a good guy. The other Tim had stayed behind for when I got back. I told him what I saw, through gasps of exhaustion and terrified hyperventilation. The 2 of us might have taken off that second, left all the supplies behind, but for 2 reasons. Firstly, Ted was still out looking for our deceased friend. 2, Ted had the keys to the truck. It was his truck. So we stood and shivered and waited for Ted to come back. He must have got himself real lost, because day turned into sunset, turned into dusk before we finally saw him again. He saw me and hastened towards us, huffing and panting by the lack of horror on his face. I figured he hadn't even stumbled across Chuck's body. A moment later, a flash of white fur burst from the woods behind him. I barely had time to shout his name before it took him to the ground. He screamed for all of half a second before the huge, wild beast tore his throat open with its vicious jaws. I pulled my gun, opened fire, a gesture less than futile. It elicited little more than a yelp of pain, and a moment later the beast turned its anger onto me. It lunged, and I reached out my left hand, instinctively trying to push it away. I lost that hand a moment later, and screamed louder and higher than I thought I could. Then, Tim made the same mistake as me, pulling his rather impressive 12-gauge from the back of the truck. He unloaded 6 rounds into the pale beast. This, too, only succeeded in pissing the monstrosity off. I'm not proud to say that, as it savagely slaughtered the last of my friends, I selfishly hobbled to the truck. I locked the doors, hoping that somehow the thin metal doors and glass windows might keep me safe. As I looked down as the stump of my left arm, I held back tears of agony. And as I noticed Ted's keys sitting on the dashboard, they were in the truck all along. I did not hesitate. With my one good arm, I jammed them in and thanked God, Buddha, Vishnu, and just about every other deity I could recall when the old Chevy started up. I booked it. Of course, a small shred of guilt nagged at me for a moment, but what the hell could I have done? The other three were surely dead, and I couldn't help them in my condition anyways. Speaking of my condition, I was behind the wheel for maybe 5 minutes before I passed out due to blood loss. I never planned on moving to the middle of nowhere, but life has a way of forcing your hand. After the divorce, I needed a fresh start. Somewhere quiet, somewhere safe for my son. The farmhouse had seemed perfect. Cheap, isolated, surrounded by fields that stretched for miles. The kind of place where a person could disappear, start over. At first, the silence was a relief. No more honking cars, no neighbors blasting music through thin apartment walls. Just the sound of wind rustling through the endless rows of corn. My 6-year-old Danny had plenty of room to run and play, and I could finally breathe without feeling like my past was closing in on me. It was supposed to be a dream. Then, on the first night, I saw them. It was late, long after Danny had gone to bed. I was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing out a glass, when I glanced out the window. At the edge of the field, just beyond the glow of the porch light, there was a figure. A man, standing still among the stalks, watching. I blinked, and he was gone. I told myself it was nothing. My eyes playing tricks, the dark twisting the shapes of the corn into something sinister. But the next night, he was back. Only this time, there were 2 of them. I locked the doors, checked the windows twice. But when I turned off the lights and lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, was out there, watching. The next morning, I told myself I had imagined it. Maybe I was just on edge from the move, nerves still raw from everything I had been through. But that excuse crumbled when Danny spoke up over breakfast. "Mom," he said, pushing his eggs around with his fork, "why was there a man outside my window last night?" I felt the blood drain from my face. I set my coffee down too hard, spilling some onto the table. "What did you say?" "A man," he repeated. I woke up because I thought I heard whispering. I looked outside, and he was just standing there. He had big, dark eyes. My stomach twisted. "Are you sure, Danny?" He nodded, taking a bite of toast like he hadn't just dropped a bomb into my morning. I watched him for a long time, but he didn't move. Then he was just gone. I ran outside before I could talk myself out of it, my heart hammering against my ribs. Dew clung to the grass, and the air smelled fresh, untouched. I circled the house, checking the ground beneath Danny's window. The dirt was soft from last night's rain. There were footprints. They were deep, clear, leading from the fields to the window, then vanishing back into the stalks. I called the police. A deputy showed up an hour later, a man in his 50s with a thick mustache and a stomach that pressed against his belt. He walked the perimeter with me, poking at the ground with his boot. "Probably just some drifter," he said. "Fields attract all kinds of folks. We get stories like this every year." I frowned. "Every year?" He gave me a tired smile. "City folk don't realize how lonely it gets out here. Sometimes the mind plays tricks. Or sometimes folks pass through looking for food, shelter." I glanced at the fields, the endless rows of corn swaying in the wind. I didn't believe him. My gut told me this was more than just some passerby. That night, I put Danny to bed early and double-checked every lock. I wasn't going to let this slide. If someone was out there, I needed to know. So I set up my old baby monitor on the windowsill and pointed it toward the fields. Then I waited. The baby monitor sat on my nightstand, its small screen glowing in the dark. The grainy feed showed the moonlit fields, the window's reflection barely visible against the glass. I sat upright in bed, my shotgun resting across my lap. I wasn't taking any chances. For hours, nothing happened. The static hum of the monitor filled the room, mixing with the occasional chirp of crickets outside. My eyes grew heavy, my grip on the shotgun loosening. Maybe the deputy had been right. Maybe it really was just some drifter passing through. Then, just past 3 in the morning, the screen flickered. My breath caught. A shape moved at the edge of the field, barely visible in the moonlight. Tall, still, watching. I leaned forward, my fingers tightening around the gun stock. The figure didn't move, didn't shift, didn't so much as sway in the breeze. It was just there. Then, without warning, the screen went black. A sharp cry rang out from down the hall. Danny. I bolted from the bed, my heart slamming against my ribs. I reached his room in seconds, throwing the door open. The air inside was ice cold. Danny was curled up in the corner, clutching his blanket, his wide eyes locked on the window. There was a face, he whispered. His voice was so small, so fragile. He was right there. I turned my gaze to the glass. Nothing, just my own reflection staring back at me. But when I stepped closer, my breath caught in my throat. The window was unlocked. A shutter rolled through me as I yanked it shut and threw the latch down. Had I left it open? No, I was sure I had checked. Had someone been inside? I pulled Danny into my arms, holding him close. "It's okay, baby," I whispered. "I won't let anything happen to you." But as I rocked him back and forth, I couldn't ignore the feeling creeping up my spine. The sensation that even with the doors locked, the windows shut, the shotgun in my hands, we weren't alone. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the hallway outside Danny's room, the shotgun resting across my knees, eyes locked on the darkened window. Every creak of the old house sent my nerves spiking. Every gust of wind against the walls made my breath catch. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When it finally did, I forced myself to step outside. The sky was still gray with the remnants of night, the cornfields shifting in a slow, ghostly rhythm. I moved cautiously toward Danny's window, half expecting to see footprints again. I found something worse. Pressed against the glass from the outside, clear as day, was a handprint. Large, smudged, the fingers slightly too long. A tremor ran through me. Someone had been there, inches away from my sleeping son. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. My first instinct was to grab Danny and drive as far away from this place as possible. But a cold thought settled in my brain. If they wanted to hurt us, they would have. This wasn't random. Whoever this was, they were playing with us. Shoving down my fear, I ran inside and grabbed my laptop. I spent the next hour ordering security cameras, overnight shipping be damned. If the police wouldn't take this seriously, I would. By the afternoon, I was working in the kitchen while Danny played on the floor. I kept my eyes on the window, refusing to let my guard down. I nearly jumped when he spoke. "Mom?" I looked down at him. His brow was furrowed, his fingers nervously twisting in his lap. "What is it, baby?" He hesitated. "What if he's not outside?" I stiffened. "What do you mean?" Danny wouldn't meet my eyes. His voice was barely above a whisper. "What if he's inside?" A chill ran down my spine. I forced a smile. "That's not possible, sweetie. The doors are locked." Danny still wouldn't look at me. His hands clenched his blanket, knuckles turning white. "Then why do I hear footsteps at night?" The words felt like ice water poured down my back. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where do you hear them?" He finally glanced up at me. "Above us." I stared at the ceiling. The attic. I had never been up there. Maybe I should have. I stood in the hallway, staring up at the attic hatch. A square of old, splintered wood in the ceiling, framed by a rusted pull-down handle. I had lived in this house for months and had never once gone up there. Now I had no choice. Danny was napping on the couch, wrapped up in his favorite blanket. I wanted to wake him, to take him to a motel anywhere but here. But if someone had been inside this house, hiding above us, I had to know. I grabbed the shotgun, then the broom handle from the kitchen. I reached up, hesitated, and yanked the hatch open. A gust of warm, stale air rushed down, carrying the scent of dust, mildew, and something faintly sour. I climbed the ladder one slow step at a time. The dim light from the hallway barely cut through the darkness, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw just enough. Mattresses. Old, filthy ones stacked in the corner. Empty cans of food. Crumpled blankets. A small pile of wrappers and bones. And worst of all, a hole in the wall leading straight to the ventilation shafts. Someone had been living here. A sharp creak made my heart lurch. I spun toward the sound, shotgun raised, but saw only shadows. A draft moved through the attic, shifting something in the corner. A piece of rope dangled near the vent, swinging gently. My pulse pounded in my ears. The rope wasn't just a rope. It was part of a ladder leading from the attic out the window. I scrambled back down, nearly slipping on the last run. I ran to Danny, scooping him up in my arms, heart racing. He stirred, mumbling sleepily, but I didn't stop. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Moving on the roof. I froze, gripping Danny tighter. A shadow passed by the living room window. Whoever had been watching us from the fields, whoever had been living in our attic, was coming back inside. I locked us in my bedroom, shoved the dresser against the door, and sat on the floor with the shotgun aimed at the entrance. Danny clung to me, trembling. The footsteps stopped above us. Then, one by one, they started coming down the attic ladder. The creak of the attic ladder sent a cold rush of terror through me. I held Danny close, my fingers wrapped tight around the shotgun's grip. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything except the slow, deliberate footsteps descending from the attic. Whoever, whatever, had been living above us was coming down. I aimed at the door, my breath shallow. The house was deathly silent now, as if it too were holding its breath. Then a new sound. Tap, tap, tap. Fingertips trailing along the hallway wall. Moving closer. Testing. Danny whimpered against my shoulder. I pressed a finger to my lips, urging him to stay quiet. My own hands were slick with sweat. My mind screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. We were trapped. A shadow passed beneath the door. I tightened my grip on the shotgun. Wait, wait. Let them get closer. The handle rattled. Slow at first. Then harder, more urgent. The dresser blocked the way, but I could hear the weight against it, pressing, pushing. Then nothing. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. My finger hovered over the trigger. Where did they go? A sound from outside sent ice through my veins. Scraping. Metal against wood. I turned to the window just in time to see a hand. Long fingers, dirt-caked nails, gripping the sill from the outside. He was climbing up. I didn't hesitate. As his face emerged in the window, a gaunt, hollow-eyed thing with cracked lips and a twisted grin, I pulled the trigger. The shotgun blast shattered the glass, and the figure tumbled back into the dark. A heavy thud followed as he hit the ground below. Danny sobbed into my chest, and I held him, whispering, "It's okay, baby, it's okay." But I didn't believe it. Not yet. I forced myself to move, legs shaking, and peered outside. The figure lay sprawled on the ground, motionless. The police arrived minutes later. The deputy took one look at the body and swore under his breath. "Son of a bitch," he muttered. They identified him the next day. A fugitive who had escaped from a prison 3 counties over. He had been using the abandoned barn on my property as his hideout for weeks. Watching, waiting, living in my attic. The sheriff's office assured me it was over, that we were safe now. But even after we moved, even years later, I never forgot. At night, in the silence, I still hear it sometimes. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of fingers trailing along the walls. When I was about 16, my family had a holiday in California to visit relatives. I kinda got friendly with one of the neighborhood kids. His name was Brett, and he was a couple of years older than me. On this particular day, Brett had decided we should hike through the countryside. My parents had no objections, having been assured that Brett knew the area like the back of his hand. We had our sleeping bags and a tent with us. Our plan was to find somewhere in the woods to set up camp for the night. Or at least I thought it was, but looking back I think Brett had other plans all along. As it got towards evening, we ended up at this place. I don't know how to describe it. It looked kinda like a holiday place and had all these wooden cabins, except that they were all a bit shabby. Not somewhere you'd really want to go on holiday, if you know what I mean. Some of them looked empty, some were boarded up, but there was what sounded like a party going on in one of them. Anyway, it had started to rain and Brett suggested we find an empty one and sneak in for the night, rather than putting up the tent. I should have realized right there something was off because we walked past at least 2 cabins that would have done just fine before he finally settled on one. I could tell he was excited about it. If anything, it looked more dilapidated than the rest. Its yellow and white paint was peeling off, and there was a number 28 next to the front door. Brett yanked on it as hard as he could, but he couldn't get it to move. The windows were all boarded up, so we made our way round to the back. The ground dropped away at the back of the cabin, and there were a couple of what looked like basement rooms that seemed completely separate from the rest of the house. In front of them, leading up to the back door, were rickety wooden stairs. Brett tried this door, and surprisingly, it swung open without effort. There was a small porch that led into what was clearly a kitchen. "Let's just dump our stuff in here," and he dropped his backpack onto the kitchen floor. I followed suit and piled my backpack and our tiny tent into a heap with his, and followed him further into the cabin. The kitchen led to a living room on the right, and a tiny passageway on the left with a door in it to the bathroom. At either end of the passageway were 2 more doors. The living room was decorated with an off-white paper covered in tiny flowers with green stems and blue flowers. There were curtains still hanging in the windows in a very 70s style orange, and against one of the walls was a sofa. There was an odd acrid smell in the room, and the walls seemed to have sprouted black mold all over them. I shuddered involuntarily. "This is going to be great for my asthma," I muttered, but Brett had already headed into the bedroom on the left. It was completely empty, and he seemed disappointed. We made our way to the room on the right. Again, it was empty. "I think we should sleep in the living room," he said. "Yeah, if I want to spend the night having asthma attacks," I said sarcastically. "Let's sleep in here. It feels warmer than the rest of the place, and there's no mold." He looked disappointed, but could obviously tell my mind was made up. He shrugged and went and grabbed his sleeping bag. I grabbed mine, and we set up camp in the bedroom. There was a large closet in the room, which I briefly explored, but there was nothing in it but a couple of empty beer cans. Apparently, we weren't the first to have this idea. We chatted for a while and had something to eat and drink. Before I knew it, my eyelids were heavy. Brett's father had dropped us off somewhere called Feather Falls early in the morning, and we'd walked all day. By 10 o'clock, I was dead to the world. I awoke to the sound of a muffled scream coming from the living room. My eyes shot open, but before I could move, I felt a small, cold hand clamp itself over my mouth. That touch froze me to my very core, and my limbs were suddenly like lead. "SHHHHHH. Pretend you're asleep. If they know you're awake, they'll kill you," a voice whispered next to me. As my wide eyes adjusted to the dark, I could see a small girl kneeling next to me. She looked around 10 years old and very slight, but her pale eyes looked older. I nodded my understanding to her, and slowly she moved her hand away. I glanced at Brett, but he was still sleeping soundly. There was another muffled scream from the living room and a woman's voice, then the sound of crying. Then suddenly I heard voices. It sounded like teenage boys arguing. There were odd pauses in the yelling, as though I was only hearing half the conversation. The girl put her finger to her lips as if to remind me to be quiet. It sounded like all hell was breaking loose in the living room. There were sickening noises, like the sound of someone bashing steak with a meat hammer. I don't know how long it went on for, but it felt like forever. It was at this point I realized I was holding her small, cold hand. I was grabbing onto this tiny girl as though my life depended on it. Tears slid down her face as she whispered, "It's almost over now. I have to go, but you have to stay here." And there was such sadness in the way she said it, I realized that I was crying too. With that, she got up and walked out the door, and utter silence filled the cabin. I wanted with all of my being to believe it was a dream, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. I tried shaking Brett, but I couldn't wake him. He was breathing deeply and seemed to be in a very sound sleep. Suddenly I had that old familiar feeling of my lungs clamping shut. I realized I'd almost been holding my breath for an hour, and the stress and panic had brought on one of my asthma attacks. I scrabbled around the floor, and then realized I'd left my backpack in the kitchen, complete with my inhaler. I tried to control my breathing to see if it eased, but it began to get worse, and suddenly I knew I had no choice. If I didn't go and get it, I might end up dead anyway. Comforting myself with the thought there hadn't been any noises in the cabin for a while, I crept out of my sleeping bag and out of the door towards the kitchen. I felt my way around the walls in the dark, praying I wouldn't make a noise, but the cabin sounded utterly quiet and empty. In the distance, I could still hear the sounds of a party coming from one of the other cabins. I grabbed my inhaler and quickly used it. My lungs began to open and finally, I could take a proper breath. The smell in there was disgusting. I was satisfied there was no one in the cabin anymore. If there had been, I'm pretty certain they'd have heard me already. I grabbed a flashlight from my backpack and made my way back towards the bedroom. As the light swung over the living room floor, I stopped dead in my tracks. As long as I live, I will never forget that sight. On the floor were 3 bodies. One by the sofa was covered with a blanket, and the other 2 teenage boys were lying on the floor. They had clearly been bludgeoned and stabbed. There was blood everywhere, even up the walls. There was no sign of the little girl, though. That's when I lost it. I went plowing into the bedroom. "Brett, wake the hell up." I was just about pulling him out of his sleeping bag. This time he woke up easily. "They're dead. All of them," I croaked. "What? You actually saw something?" I had no idea what he was talking about, and in that moment I didn't care. Babbling incoherently and practically dragging him by the arm, I pulled him into the living room. My mouth fell open. There was nothing there. The walls were covered in wood paneling. The flowery wallpaper was gone, and there were no curtains, there was no sofa, and definitely no bodies. Honestly, Brett, I was almost sobbing again. There were bodies, 3 of them, and the rooms all changed. Brett looked at me dubiously. "Someone told you about this place, didn't they?" "Nobody told me anything. I don't know anyone here, do I, dumbass? There were wallpaper and a sofa." I trailed off. "No, there wasn't," he hissed, and I could sense the panic beginning to rise in his voice. This room was empty, and there wasn't any wallpaper. I was dumbstruck. Clearly, Brett hadn't seen the room as I had seen it. "I just want to get the hell out of here," and I barged past him into the kitchen. I grabbed my backpack and stumbled down the back stairs in the dark. Brett followed closely behind me. We half ran and half stumbled to the cabin where the sounds of partying were coming from and banged on the door. A very drunk, very pretty girl answered it, and we asked if we could use the phone. She took one look at our pale faces and gave a low whistle. "You been in cabin 28, ain't ya?" We nodded dumbly. I called my dad, and within the hour we were in the car heading home. I could feel the anger coming from the driver's seat on the journey home. My dad wasn't exactly pleased with being disturbed in the early hours. Brett and I spoke very little in the car. I did mention to him how hard it had been to wake him up, and he looked at me with these tortured eyes. "I could hear you, but I couldn't wake up. I was dreaming I was trapped under the floorboards in a little wooden house. It's the most terrifying dream I've ever had in my life," and he shuddered. I never saw him again after that night. The next day I was sick, and by the time I was feeling better, it was time to go back home. At the time this took place, I had no internet, so the memories of that night were unexplained for a long time. Brett never told me where we'd gone, but I've always felt our visit there was no accident. I think he wanted to check it out, and in me found someone completely ignorant of the history of the place. Recently, however, I checked out Cabin 28 online. I read about the gruesome murder of a woman and her son and his friend, and the disappearance of her 12-year-old daughter, whose bones were later found near Feather Falls. I read about the children that slept through the whole thing in the bedroom Brett and I occupied that night. I met my partner when he was visiting England for business. Our companies had some trivial partnership together. They used us as their UK-based foothold, and we used them as our American counterpart. It was something about cutting costs and allowing each other to conduct sales without having to undergo endless procedures, though I'm almost certain if you delved into it, there were more clandestine reasons like tax benefits. But it wasn't really our place, nor our motive, to check. He had flown over with a small handful of their company ambassadors, whereas ours had selected a few of us to partake in the seminars. It was very much what you'd expect. A pitiable bland room, with clinical lighting, uncomfortable chairs set in rows. A whiteboard heading the room so that the buzzing projector above could show menial slide after tedious statistic. And everyone's favorite, the table at the back crowded with small polystyrene cups, urns of filter coffee and breakfast tea, as well as an assortment of the most tragic sandwiches you could imagine. I stifled a groan, initially, when I was one of the names called out at having the honor to represent our business, nay, our country, to our American brothers and sisters. Not because of the interaction with them, but because of the content, staff training, staff motivation, team building, anything of that ilk was enough to claw at the happiness of any sane human. It did mean a week out of work, which was nice, but going off any of the previous ones I'd attended, I couldn't help but think work was the better option. However, as soon as I saw him scrolling on his phone, sitting amongst the throng, all chattering about mundanities, clearly sharing my dislike and disinterest for the week ahead, I couldn't help but feeling a little elation from a kindred spirit. Misery loves company and all that. The first day was what you'd expect, but when the two of us were paired up for a role-playing exercise, and partook while skirting around the task at hand with sarcasm and cynicism, I could tell he found that connection too. Perhaps when you're tottering about at the bottom of the barrel, anything of worth you find is highlighted. I'm not complaining, it worked in my favor. The next day, I could see he sat closer to me, and between speakers and clips, he'd throw a furtive glance at me, giving a roll of the eyes and a wry smile, or miming an exasperated exhalation. Each time I smiled. We chatted, and by the third day, we were sitting next to each other. His colleagues and my own noticed that we were chatting away, and, as if plummeting back into the depths of primary school, began encouraging the two of us to swap the filter coffee for something a tad more substantial and creamy, so we did just that. I showed him about London, and of course Soho, which was only 2 tube stops away from where the cursed business centre was situated. He was gobsmacked. Looking through every window, gawping at every same-sex couple passing us by without a hint of danger, and hitting me with a fusillade of questions. He was from a super conservative, modest-sized town near Utah, and said that anything like this would be almost an invitation for abuse over there. Even where he was living now, a slightly bigger town which was fairly more liberal, was still nowhere on a level such as this. We got our coffee latte for me, Americano for him, go figure, chatted away, went for dinner, went for drinks, spent the next day hungover and subject to smug glances and loaded smirks from our colleagues. And then, before we knew it, the week ended. We both knew we didn't want that to be the end of our correspondence, so we swapped details, stayed in contact, and well, the rest is history. For the first 3 years, we dabbled with the idea of a long-distance relationship. He'd fly over to England, I'd fly over to America, we'd spend as much of our holidays as we can around one another, then fly back. It was working well enough, but we weren't getting any younger. We wanted stability. I approached my bosses speaking about a possible transfer. It was easier than expected. Before long, my desk was cleaned, my apartment was packed, my visa was prepared, and my flights were booked. We moved in together straight away, and considering this was not in my next 5 years plan, it was the smoothest move I'd ever had. Seriously, moving from southeast London to North London was a much more burdensome and chaotic feat. But here I was, being woken up with a gentle nudge of the shoulder, and the heavenly scent of coffee to greet me, latte for me, Americano for him, redecorating the home because I wanted to have both our input, exploring my new town and settling myself into a brand new work environment. And thus, the exposition ends. I've been living here for 2 years now, and finally, the topic of meeting his family has come up. The two of us had never really broached the subject over the 3 years of communication before I moved here. It would be a week or 2 if we were lucky, and we just wanted to spend every second together. But seeing as my presence was a mainstay, that we were living together, navigating the world together, It seemed only fitting that my existence was brought to his parents' attention. They had a little log cabin, a quaint twee affair, situated in some immense forest. When he told me, he noticed that I was agape at the nonchalance in which he broke this news to me. "Oh, it's no big deal. They bought it for next to nothing. Path Walker Cabin, it's called. It used to be a ranger lodging when the area was popular for hiking, but the trail was too difficult for beginners and too easy for anyone experienced, so it just kinda got abandoned." He said they used to go there every year when he was younger, but by the time his sister and he were teenagers, the trip stopped. Either his parents would rent it out to close friends, mutual friends, distant acquaintances, and ultimately, complete strangers for a modest sum depending on the connection, or his parents would leave him and his sister to their family home, and they would enjoy the privacy and solitude that only a cabin in the woods could offer. Now it was my turn to ask question after question. The way the city streets of London were so far removed from his comfort zone, the idea of spending a week in the middle of some isolated forest, sequestered from any neighbors or civilization, and only each other for company was alien. I couldn't tell if I was nervous or excited about the idea, but he tried to win me over by pinning the most romanticized idea a cabin in the woods could author, rather than the outright terrifying. Oh, the things I was promised. Sitting in the old comfy chairs together, as we stoked the cindering charcoal in the roaring hearthside, knowing that outside, the snow was peppering down with a silent grace, but the pervasive cold would have no invitation. How I'd meet his dog, old and loyal it was, and though half senile, had incredible levels of energy and a proclivity for playing and hugs. How his mom and dad would question me about my parents, my family, my goals. About England, about the monarchy, and soccer, questions of which I fretted, since in sooth, I knew very little. How, if his sister came with her kids, we would set up a huge fire outside, sit around on the little log stools, pick the best stick we could find from the encroaching forest, and use them to melt marshmallows. S'mores. Me, a nobody from the south of England, was going to eat s'mores like some cute romantic movie. It was a pleasing concept. It didn't take long before I was won over by the idea, and he promised that no matter what, he would bat away any awkwardness that presented itself, the mounting worry above all others by being outnumbered by his family. We booked the holiday off work. We went shopping for matching camping gear just in case, and thermal gear a necessity, as well as little essential tools, and my favorite purchase, the same 3 books each, so we can read through them together when tucked away in our little room. I used to have a little reading nook there, he explained, but I never got much reading done. From my window, you can see where the forest falls into, a decline, I guess. I used to sit with my binoculars as a kid and just watch the birds and squirrels and whatever else. It's pretty cool. Well, who was I to say no to such a profoundly different experiences than what England could offer? We don't have vast wildernesses, we have moors, we have forests, we have woods, sure, but nothing on the level of what he'd shown me in photos or old, crackling family movies. Fast forward to the day before we left, and in spite of myself, I was brimming with excitement. The sort of butterflies that storm about your stomach in a tumult on the first day back at school, or when you're trying to sleep on Christmas Eve. The ones that, with each stomach toss, conjure infinite thoughts and fancies in your head that can only be sated by acknowledging each one with the respect and audience it deserves, and then moving on to the next with as much veneration. I decided, in my wide-awake, anxious excitement, that it would work in my favor to study some camping skills. Imagine me sitting there, in the midst of this new family, as the green boy from overseas who had no camping experience, when all of a sudden, I grabbed the flint and tinder and scratched sparks into the firewood. Surely, I could pick up some basic skills to impress my potential new family. I started going through endless guides, mostly clickbait articles, or amateur vloggers that narrated their own imagined hazards in camping grounds, before giving up on the idea of trying to arrive tomorrow as twink grills. I'm sure anything I needed to know would be either taken care of for me, or taught to me by him or his family. So instead, I started looking into what to expect in regards to bugs, or predators, or general hazard of geography, when I stumbled upon something peculiar. An article headed, "A Night at Utah's Skinwalker Cabin." Obviously, my attention was instantly commanded by the impact of the title, clickbait or not, but even more so by the image that was attached to it. I'm by no means known for my photographic memory, but I'd often flicked back through the photos he'd shown me, the way you'd look at hotels you've booked or experiences you've planned to generate a level of excitement. The image looked eerily similar to those pictures. I clicked in and eagerly began to read. The forests around Utah are renowned for their vegetation, their towering trees, their abundant wildlife, and their well-trodden hiking trails. My buddy and I have been updating our blog about our experiences, and each one links to those below, but none of them could compare in adventure to our night at Skinwalker Cabin. As soon as we stepped foot in this forest, something felt off. We'd heard of the disappearances, the legends, the ghost stories, or the alleged sightings, but that's never stopped us before camping an abandoned gold mine. We stuck to the hiking trail that was once a popular destination, but it was clear to see this was no longer used. There was a faint vestige of a path, highlighted by a vague alteration in the overgrowing nature, but it wasn't long before the trail was swallowed by the forest, and the two of us decided we would try find our own way. Even in broad daylight, we felt a sense of uneasiness, but as it started getting dark, it was almost unbearable. It felt like tucked away in the canopy, there was some intelligent presence glaring down at us, or peering at us from the distance behind some shadowed trunk, of phenomenon that is often claimed by people as stupid as us to attempt to find the cabin. My heart was already pounding, feeling like I had stumbled upon something desecrated, something illicit, some deep and dark family secret that I was not meant to uncover. I could feel my heart hammering, my breath hollow, and with as little disturbance to his sleeping frame beside me as possible, I opened a new window on my phone, being sure to keep this odd little blog saved so I can go back to it, and typed in Skinwalker Cabin. Varying articles popped up, some going into the legends of skinwalkers, something I'd heard of briefly, but knew very little about, providing information about their origins and supernatural qualities. But as much as I wanted to delve down that rabbit hole, it wasn't quite what I was looking for. I wanted to see if this cabin. I kept scrolling, clicking into link after link, trying to make my web page fall upon what my anxieties were alluding to. Utah National Forest, Wilderness of Utah, unexplained disappearances, body found on trail, stalked through the night, legend of skinwalkers, Navajo lore, and then Pathwalker Cabin, which is more commonly known by locals and thrill seekers and wilderness enthusiasts as Skinwalker Cabin, has been home and central to countless tales surrounding mysteries, murders, and "Why are you still up?" I heard from behind me, and my soul almost catapulted from my mouth. He could see I was panicked and flustered, and that energy only woke him up from his sleeping stupor. I froze. I was within my right to say I was just looking into the trip and stumbled on this stuff, was a little creeped out and just wanted to find out more about it. But I just could utter the words. It was almost as if saying them aloud would make it real, or at the very least cause a bit of an argument. Prawn. Oh, he yawned, laying back down with his forearm covering his eyes. Well, get to sleep soon, we're up early. He turned away, somewhat disinterested by my ingenious excuse, and I, for the rest of that night, began to slip into one of those deep, obsessive holes that only vapid, endless forums and poorly written blogs could offer. Because the next day I was going to be staying in Skinwalker Cabin, and I needed to promptly terrify myself and allow every horrifying story from twisted crimes to unexplained supernatural time to take root in my overactive, anxious mind, just like any well-adjusted 30-year-old would. And let me tell you, I didn't like what I read. Never mind the fact I may be part of the next story, part 2. I didn't realize I had even drifted off until I felt the warmth of the sun stroking my cheek and winced, squeezing my eyes tight, preparing myself to open my eyes. When I did, I could see it was fighting its way through the thin, cloth curtains he chose, filling the room with a pale, lilac hue. I checked my phone to find the time, only to see I had 3% of battery left, And even worse, the alarm wasn't set for another 5 minutes. It was 6:55, and the last time I had checked, before I dozed off, I saw it was 3:30, and I had been scrolling for a while after that. So, I had very little sleep to last me for a long day of driving, and delving into new experiences, and meeting my potential in-laws for the first time. Not ideal, by any stretch of the imagination. I lay still in bed, awaiting those 5 minutes, which, whenever you wanted them to last as long as possible, seemed to race by at such blinding speeds, purely to spite you, and you alone. His alarm went off, and I prepared to get up, only to be pulled into a sudden little spoon position. I shrugged and accepted it. But with my mind slowly waking up, I began to reflect on the stories I read the night before, and wonder just why, oh why, I had gotten myself into this position. I've never been a big believer in the supernatural. Of course, as a child I'd tremble in fear at the local boogeyman that every neighborhood has, somehow surviving generation after generation. But the older I got, the more real life had to take priority over the supernatural facets a younger mind has the leisure of homing. It wasn't the stories of skinwalkers or witches or rituals or unexplained disappearances, bizarre sightings or unidentifiable creatures that spooked me. It was the real-life murder cases that seemed to rack up in high numbers over the years. One article went as far as stating that you couldn't walk more than 5 minutes without potentially passing wildlife that was nurtured by the blood of an unnamed victim. These woods, it seemed, were notorious for the last known location of many hikers, some of which had videos as they went in, giddy with excitement at facing Skinwalker Woods, and wanting to hit some level of internet fame amongst the avid hiking community afterward, only to never be seen again. But even outside of that, there were many on the opposite end of the scale. A lot of bodies found who were never identified. Some were left to the elements and curious wildlife, but were stumbled upon in a condition in which their features and dental records should be some identifier, yet no one claimed the lost souls. But others, lacerations, eviscerations, mounds of coagulating pulp, viscera, bones stained a ghastly pink. They were beyond recognition, and DNA testing was at a loss to give their families, or memory, any peace. I just don't get why. Why would this be a destination anyone would purchase a cabin? Why would this be a place? Best get up. His voice croaked from the nook in my neck, and I yelped with the sudden snap from my horrid rumination. The two of us tore ourselves from bed. He went to check we had everything in order before we got ready to leave, whilst I made my way to the bathroom. Whilst showering, I stood leaning with my arm against the glass wall and letting the almost too hot water drench my body, wiping clean the griminess of a poor sleep and hoping it would sluice the building anxiety in my mind. This was just what I did sometimes. I'd let myself focus on any negative aspect, to put it lightly, of anything that I'm tentative about. There were also a lot of people who went on the trips to the woods I was going to, and had experienced nothing, much to their maniacal dismay. I was going to be going with the man I loved, with the family he loved, in a house they'd happily stayed at without event multiple times, all of whom could boast varying levels of wilderness training. It wasn't as if I was going to be airdropped in the middle of some desecrated, impossibly dense thicket with a loincloth and my blunted wits, then survive for the full time. I was going for a cute getaway where I could stroke a family dog, make awkward small talk with his family, rest on an old, probably moth-eaten couch as I read or pretended I liked hard whiskey in front of a snapping, crackling, and popping fire. Why was I letting my ever unwelcome, but always attending anxiety to taint what could, possibly, be one of the best trips of my life? There was a little rap hurry the F up in their baby rap at the door, which once again snapped me back into function, and I realized with a fug of steam that had begun billowing about the room, condensing on the shower walls, fogging up the mirror, and causing the ceramic tiles to sweat, I had been in for a little longer than the 10 minutes I was allotted. I popped out as he walked in, and had the quick, near-silent transaction of, "All good." "Yep," he replied, clearly hiding the fact that he was slightly irked at my overstepping the schedule, but well aware we had a long drive together, and bickering would at least double that, even if just in perception. You? Yep, I replied, knowing that his question held the subversive order to be fully dried and ready to go by the time he was out, and if I wanted to earn back the brownie points that were just docked, that I'd also have his Americano waiting in his reusable coffee cup. Of course I did. We were on the road before long, and it suddenly hit me just how little of the expanding areas I'd seen. We'd visited Salt Lake City for one weekend work trip, but only got to see very little outside of smiling faces ill-fitting on motivational speakers' mouths. And that was also with 3 others, so the journey there, which was, perhaps an hour at most, was focused on spinning every plate of precariousness patter we could all manage as well-meaning, uniform work friends. I was lucky I made him the coffee, because he seemed to be in a good enough mood by the time we had left our little town behind, giving my kneecap little reassuring squeezes as if to say, without having to actually let the words slip his mouth, "This is fine, this is going to be fun." But by the 5th affectionate little pincer motion, I couldn't ascertain whether it was my bubbling nerves he was trying to assuage or his own. It wasn't long before we were very much in the road trip mood. The sun had claimed its rightful place in the sky, etching out any lingering chill from the long night before and breathing life and color onto the picturesque landscape. Every time I glanced out the window, it felt like I was the luckiest person alive. I'd been to art galleries and tried my utmost to appreciate what late minds had conferred onto a canvas through talent, with incredible colors, accuracy, and dexterity, but as uncultured as I am, none of them compared to what these small car windows were showing. We veered around winding hills and snailed across rugged mountains, and lazily strolling past us was the breathtaking beauty of the Utah wilderness in its vast and incomprehensible glory. The deep green of the trees held a stark contrast to the bright blue of the soothing sky, even as they crept ever upward, with no gap or pause, like a stoic band of veteran mountaineers. Brandon was telling me about the sort of creatures that would be homed within there, that should we park the car and take a leisurely little jaunt within the shaded forests, we may happen upon a roaming bear or a mountain lion stalking prey to feed its cubs, which had me sufficiently terrified. He could probably see my discomfort from the pallid complexion suddenly pervading my face, because he quickly tried to shift the species into elk or deer or anything that wouldn't tear me alive before devouring me. "Oh no," he explained, when I made a joke acknowledging the hardly subtle tactic. "Bears tend to keep their prey alive for as long as they can." He glanced over to me for a moment, before letting his eyes focus back on the road as it disappeared beneath our wheels. He licked his lips, then whispered, as if a secret between him and me keeps it fresh. We started chatting a lot about other places he'd visited in the state and other states, before comparing them to my complete lack of any outdoor life back in England. I was telling him that the closest I could offer was a dreary bus ride, then short walk to Durdle Door, which, though beautiful, may be considered boring for someone who has had to light fires in the heart of a forest to keep wolves away. The conversation fizzled with the vestiges of civilization, and in its stead, we had begun blasting music from our radio, knowing that there was no human ear nearby to complain about the volume or our terrible singing. We performed 2 full musicals unashamedly stereotypical in that sense, belted our hearts and near eviscerated our throats to the likes of Bonnie Tyler, Jennifer Hudson, Petula Clark, Joni Mitchell, before veering into more modern tastes in which we could just casually half-mumble lyrics. Sometimes we'd fall into a lull as the little car that could powered ever onward, and I'd just rest my head on the window, feeling the vibration of the engine or the sudden jaggedness of the terrain. It was during one such lull I could sense he was wanting to say something, that intuition where you can feel there's a heaviness, a tacit, pregnant vibe that just builds in tension. It came on so sudden that I kept looking over, as if to offer the window for him to broach it and resolve it, so we could go back to singing, or maybe even treat myself to a little snooze. Then, finally, "Okay, so I have something to confess about this trip." Already, within his tone, I could sense an immense level of hesitation, and he seemed somewhat fearful to even have spoken, as if he regretted saying anything at all. This wasn't going to be comfortable, and I thought I knew why. Instantly, my mind's eye reread all those articles I traded in lieu of a good sleep, and flashed across the images, more pointedly, the little wooden sign that once read Path Walker Cabin, but had been crudely etched in a face so as to say Skinwalker Cabin instead. Was he about to finally confess that this place we were going wasn't the utopian holiday destination he'd built up? So my parents should already be there, he spoke, leaving that sign lingering just before me. I blinked rapidly and trained my suspicious on him. And my sister may or may not be there already. Okay, it was leading somewhere, I just couldn't see the route to my paranoia on its current path. And that's a confession because... No, that's leading to the confession. His mouth opened and closed a few times as an endless crusade of trees swept past his profile. Opened my phone and checked their last text. I started feeling anxious, now but not in an I'm going to a popular murder destination anxiety, but stop making me feel like something's off anxiety. Well, I suppose the two lines cross there. I reached forward slowly, keeping my confused look at him, and noted that he was tight-lipped, which is how he got when he was expecting me to be annoyed. I grabbed the phone and read the text, sent from his dad just before we left. Hey Brandon, your mom and I set off early so we can clean the place. You know how it can get if there's been any trespassers, so it looks presentable for you too. Really happy you're coming down, son. Can't wait to meet her. Took you long enough. Haha, your mom made me say that. Dad. I read the text about 1,000 times within a second, before homing in on the one word I could tell was the root of his anxiety, her. I managed after a while. So, they think they don't know you're into. I'm so sorry, he said, instantly trying to begin damage control. We've never had the conversation, and I don't know, I wanted to tell them, but kept putting it off until I met someone I thought was worth the hassle. The hassle, I repeated, in my own shrieking rendition. No, you're not a hassle. I mean, they're not the most conservative pair. But I mean, you know how it can be. I just never wanted to go through the whole, is it a phase? Or are you sure? Or you just haven't met the right girl. He was speaking rapidly, clearly panicking. And when I met you, well, when we kept talking, I was like, well, he's cool, but he's literally in England. But then we kept chatting, and then visiting, and I was like, well, this is something I never expected, but nothing will come of it. What? Not nothing. But I mean, you know, one hand left the steering wheel to punctuate the incoming question. How many people have done what we've done? Met someone overseas, stay in touch to the point that, like, how was I supposed to know some business meeting would have me get a coffee with some random English guy who'll turn out to be the love of my life? No, I had nothing to say. Okay, good damage control, I made a mental note, which I think he noticed. And then I was going to tell them when we were planning you moving over, because I was like, well, this is it, this is the guy, this is my future. Okay, milking it a little now. But I've only seen them twice since, and both times was me visiting for a funeral. And I didn't think it was sensible to drop an R.I.P. Aunt Doris. By the by, Mom and Dad, I'm gay, you know? Well, yeah, but that's not good enough, I know. I should have found the time or the moment, but... No, I mean, I'm not annoyed that you haven't told them it's not ideal, but it's not my place to say when you tell anybody anything. But, like, you could have told me they didn't know so I can try and prepare myself for the whole, you know, surprising them by, not being a woman. It'll be fine, I promise, he reiterated with complete conviction, or a great act. It's just they'll be confused, but they're not like religious nuts or anything. Spiritual, yeah, but not the fire and brimstone kind of mindset. Right, I said after a short, tense pause. Let's unpack this for a sec. We spoke about it for a while, and the anxiety that flared up in both parties soon began to satiate and gutter out into a faint, but ever-glowing ember. Yet, even when the conversation was resolved and the case was closed, I could still feel something on my behalf had been left unsaid. I was going back over it all and chewing the inside of my gum, when somewhere deep in the annals of my thoughts, my pettiness watered the seed. It was the text, but not the fact that he hadn't told them. I played it back in my mind and realized there was something in there that not being a woman overtook. What did your dad mean by trespassers? Oh, he paused for a moment, letting the S trail. Nothing. Sometimes when they go, they see that there's been some hiker who has took refuge or say something's missing or whatever else. Then quickly, when he could sense that I'd held my breath. Not anything malicious. The trail is a popular spot for some people who it's a bit of a bragging right to complete it. And some, instead of finding a campsite, they'll stay in the cabin. So anytime we're staying over, my mom and dad just go earlier than anyone else to clean anything up. And then, with a pointed follow-up, but it's never anything bad. I instantly felt a chill rise within me, thinking about the fact that aside from the vloggers, bloggers and loggers that may have taken it upon themselves to crawl within the cabin, there may very well have been a time when one of the John or Jane Does stayed there before they were killed, or any of the disappeared folk, or even, God forbid, any of the people that made them disappear. I thought of 100 ways I could ask the question, or bring up the fact that I'd spent the night scrolling about horror stories of all sort about the very place we were rolling on our merry little way toward, but none of them sounded like a good idea. So instead, when introspection was too much to handle, I decided my best course of action was, weird question, he jerked his chin up a fraction to bid me ask. But do you have, weapons there? Guns, knives, whatever? No, we don't leave them in the cabin, but we wouldn't visit without them, he said sternly. He looked at me and searched my expression, as if wanting to angle a thought right from the turbulence within. You can't go into the middle of a national forest without protection. You'd probably never need it. Anything in there is more likely scared of you than you are of it. But no animals would come near the cabin when they see people in it. And we never go through the tree line alone. It's just textbook scout stuff. We don't really do scouts, Brandon, I wanted to argue. But he'd be the one I'd be relying on to save my life should some bear want a fresh serving of my bowels. So I decided to keep the smart remarks to myself. Though it took a Herculean effort to tell him it wasn't animals I was worried about. We drove in contemplative silence for a while, something I really appreciated about my time with him. It's nice to be able to sit and think in the company of someone, never always having the need to fill in the void. There was just the gentle purr of our car, and the esoteric peace that just the two of us on quiet roads offered. It was getting almost impossible to stay awake, as the car seemed to sway from left to right, left to right, left to right. I relaxed into the seat and told Brandon I'm just going to rest my eyes for a few minutes, which was met with a loaded grin. Perhaps 30 to 40 minutes went by, and I spent all of it pondering on the articles and playing out myriad scenarios in which his parents would denounce me and have me sprinting through the forest to escape their unaccepting ways regardless of what he said about them not being nuts. The fear is ingrained. Then quickly thinking about animals lurking in the distance as we sat in the cabin, slinking just out of line of sight and watching us as we went about our business. But even though that was all unsettling in thought, I felt a sudden unshakable sense of despair. It was so profound that it rocketed from me lazy, listless stupor, and the fear began to unfurl in me, gathering like storm clouds ready to flash in a vicious fulmination. Brandon noticed that I'd just woken, and in complete contrast, offered a relaxed, incongruous, "Oh, perfect time. We have officially just crossed the line of territory for the National Forest." I could only stare back, waiting for my mind in turmoil to settle. Welcome to your home away from home. I didn't feel welcome. I didn't feel at all welcome. If anything, I suddenly felt the need to grab the steering wheel, execute a U-turn, and spin us back around. Perhaps it was because above, giant sheets of gray clouds had started sailing into view, coalescing to steal the world below of its earlier vibrancy. Or perhaps because with every inch the car stole, the roads seemed to devolve into barely distinguishable pathways, in which cement and railings were replaced with creeping vines and broken twigs. Or maybe because all of a sudden, we weren't driving through the unmapped, unclaimed nature, but seemed suddenly swallowed by it. Devoured. Like walking into the maw of a waiting beast. Through every window, There was nothing but towering trunks that thrust upward, mighty and proud, as if to make it clear this was their home, and we were invading. We were going slower now, and the deeper we rolled into the wood, the thicker the canopy got, the darker the world seemed. It felt as if we were tiptoeing, afraid to be caught suddenly by some menacing landowner. Though it wasn't quite necessary, Brandon flicked the high beams on, and two great lances of light speared before us, disclosing the mossy secrets that the forest had tried to keep from us in its pulsing gloom. I ducked in my chair to try and get a better view of the scale, feeling like an ant, but felt a little nauseous that some of these trees seemed to scale way higher than the skyscrapers of London I had grown so accustomed to. I was used to looking up and seeing the sheen of a pale sun or smoggy sky reflecting on glinting windows, knowing that inside there were office workers tapping away at their computers or answering calls, just begging for the 5 o'clock to hit. But this, I felt as if whatever resided in those trees were lurching, cocking their heads at the strange new metallic beast that began prowling beneath. I almost wanted to turn the lights off, worried that it was either drawing attention to us or even expecting some shape to flit in front of it at any moment. The darkness seemed to inch closer, as if the slithers of horizon that we could between the battalion of wooden titans was slowly being claimed before our very eyes. But Brandon, he seemed very focused on just moving forward. I didn't get a sense of uneasiness from him, perhaps because it was almost non-existent in comparison to mine, but just an imperturbable goal to go forward, deeper, deeper. And it suddenly dawned on me, as if planted in my mind, that I was in America. I was in Utah, in some vast and endless ocean of wilderness, with a guy that, though I loved, was the one and only anchor to my social life here. My entire existence in this country was at his mercy. And then the dark thoughts began to take root and fester. What if those disappearances, those unexplained deaths, what if I had unwillingly just let myself know? I severed the thought before it could even finish forming. I was out of my comfort zone, I was allowing my imagination to run rampant, and I was just anxious about meeting his. Thud, the two of us screamed in an outburst of terror as something heavy, weighty, hit the hood of the car. There was a moment of further panic when the car veered to the left, but he quickly regained control and started to speed up down the vague path, arched by knitted branches that seemed to droop lower and lower, as if the bristling, leaden sky was attempting to grab at us. "Slow down," I begged, screaming through the sudden burst of fright. Thud, thud, another 2 hard bangs from above, each one instilling utmost chaos within our little car. "What's that?" he cried, wide-eyed and pushing further down on the pedal. I could already tell he was in a fit of distress, both staring ahead, but not fully watching where he was going. If he didn't calm down, I could see us crashing at full speed into a trunk. It was clear we would be the ones who would lose in such a case. "Just slow down," I roared. But when I leant forward to try and get a view of whatever had just landed on the car, I felt a twist of terror consume me, every fiber of my being suddenly ablaze with the inconsolable need to get away, go fast. But it was on the car. "Speed up. Go, faster. Oh my God, Brandon." "What?" he cried, infected by my escalation. "Someone's on the car," I was sobbing. "Go, someone's on the roof." I caught, for a fraction of a second, just at the top of the windscreen, 2 human fingers. They were muddied and rotten, with overgrown yellowing nails, but as quick as they were there, they were gone. Thud, thud, thud. There was complete cacophony, and the bronchides from above seemed to hit with such a power that the car vibrated, any remnant of coherency shattered from my brain. But in a moment of miraculous clarity, an idea came on me so quickly. It was as if the horror had taken over. I snapped the seatbelt from myself and leant forward in one swift motion, yanking his foot from the accelerator and pushing down the emergency brake. Then I watched before us, waiting to see whoever it was go hurtling before the window, and as soon as they did, I would absolutely have pushed back down on the accelerator and ensured we caught their body in our path. But there was nothing. No noise, no yell, no body, no thud. Outside of our heavy breathing and the grumbling of the agitated engine, we heard nothing but the backdrop of singing birds and taunting frisons between the leaves, causing them to hiss and titter with a mocking laughter. "Someone was on the car," I whispered, struggling to form the words. "I saw a hand." "A hand?" he yelped. "Shush," I shot sharply. "They're still there. They have to be. That's why I—" Brandon's face suddenly contorted into a rage I'd never seen painted on his always composed expression, and with blinding speed, he reached below his seat, retrieved a small black pistol, much to my shock and horror, before pulling at the door handle to get out the car. "No, wait," I tried, but he was already stepping a foot out. I quickly mirrored his action, getting outside of my car and terrified, waiting to see the snarling, wild face of some madman murderer. But when we stood up, we could only see each other's faces across the top of the car. Instantly, we both checked behind us to see if something had fallen off, and in front, just in case we missed it. But there was nothing, not even the sign of a sudden scuffle. Just two stretching tracks which our tires bit into the soft ground. He began to aim the gun off the pathway, as if any moment some assailant may erupt from wherever they were hidden, and I began to feel terribly vulnerable. Then, splat, I screamed, and Brandon trained the pistol on where the sound came from. Which is when we saw a little conker exploded on the path, a few meters behind. Brandon gave me a tentative look, as if waiting for something else to happen. When splat, another conker, a little further in the distance. Then he began to laugh. "A hand?" he asked over the car, his voice now light and playful with the weight of relief. I was starting to blush, realizing now just how impossible that would have been. For someone to drop on our car from above, meaning they would be high up in these gargantuan trees, with the accuracy and agility to actually land, and then hold on through the speed, all the while banging on the roof. Maybe it was twigs, a branch. Maybe you're just dramatic when you're tired. Maybe thaw. Just behind me, we heard the deep, loud call of some bird, which made me duck suddenly, as shaken as I was, and Brandon aimed his gun with alert. There was something unsettling about the proximity of it, and the way it called was almost as if laughing at the two men that had nearly crashed because of falling conkers. But by the time I looked to where the sound was coming from, I could just hear the beating of unseen wings, and a swift shadow flit from view. The two of us laughed now, clearly in the throes of gratitude. But still, that feeling of invading, of being monitored, studied, stalked, began to eradicate the temporary respite. And Brandon must have felt the same, because the two of us got back in the car, and without speaking, double-checked the locks. So, maybe don't tell my parents about that. They already say I'm the worst camper because of my imagination. Well, I don't see why you'd worry when you literally whipped a gun from the depths of your ass. What the F, Brandon? He grinned. You don't go into a national forest without protection, I said. I didn't argue. Conkers or not, I was glad he had it. It should be about another 20 minutes before we're at the end of this road, Brandon said, trying to sound normal, relaxed. But I could tell there was a huge level of distress sneaking beneath the tone. It used to go all the way through to where the cabin was, but when the rangers left it wasn't maintained anymore. Then, how will we know when we're there? Because the path will end, and we'll see my mom's car there, he added then, actively trying to make it sound a menial task. Then it's just an hour's walk. I didn't want to go the rest of the way. I didn't want to see his mom's car. I didn't want to do an hour's walk. I wanted to go home. Yet I felt powerless as the car rolled forward, and both of us, despite the scenario having an explanation, kept nervously glancing outside the windows, letting our eyes search up the treetops above us, and constantly checking the rear-view mirror. Already, I despised this trip, and the constant sound of that deep, eerie bird call that seemed to follow us and multiply in all directions did nothing to calm my nerves. Part 3. It seemed with every inch that was swallowed by the front of the car, the forest seemed to close in on us. The road had melted into a memory of civilization and gave way to encroaching foliage. It crept, as silent as an assassin, until there was a constant whisper of drooping, reaching lives caressing the roof, scratching ineffectively at the windows. Even before, when the large road powered through the titanic trees, the sun had been obstructed, but now the canopy was devouring the last of the delicate golden rays, so that it seemed like we were in an unsettling, wild twilight. The path had fizzled to pressed dead pine needles and a vague outline. My breathing had slowed from the height of panic, and I kept telling myself that, of course, it was conkers dropping down. They must snap from their precarious hold with every gust or breeze, peppered down like an April shower on the road, as well as leaves and twigs and old branches. We were just in a world I didn't belong, had never ventured into. I was used to life where my phone could predict the weather. There was no need for experience or oracles anymore. Technology did everything for us, from the mystical to the mundane. Yet, that flash of the fingers. It was as if they had clawed to my vision, to my memory. Two little squiggles that followed me wherever I looked. It may have been a million things, but why would my brain instantly snap to that? There was very little time to process much else. The detail was vivid and haunting. Grubby, caked in dried mud. They seemed to be almost dyed so as to camouflage into the very soil that the greenery had blanketed. And let's say I glimpsed two twin conkers, falling from the same stem. How did they stay there in place before going back up? And how did I see two overgrown yellow fingernails? Somewhere in the haze of chaos and the clarity of fear, I could see the ends of them crude and cracked, as if never cared for, never treated with delicacy, certainly never manicured. There was nothing I'd ever seen on a conker, that in my youth I would smash together with friends, that could be mistaken for what I'd seen then. But what else could it have been? The relief of surviving the encounter was enough to anchor me, but my mind, stomach, soul, and conscience were already tainted and defeated. I checked out the window to see only an endless horde of lithe and monstrous tree trunks, small bursts and great palls of leaves, from gray to browning to faint, shaded, secretive black. I looked in the mirror, wanting to ensure that there was nothing behind us, yet, just as it was in the side, it was at the back though, thankfully a much smaller range of view. It was a miracle that Brandon was even managing to navigate a path forward. Miraculous more so that people in their sanity actually ventured into a place like this, not only willingly, but thrillingly. I'd felt uncomfortable enough in alleyways that I knew well back home, back in London, and even they were home to puddles of light that spilled in from the main street shaded darker, but still aglow. Here I could maybe see about 6 to 8 foot before my vision was obscured by shadow or trunk. How could people consider them safe? Checking for the roof hanger, Brandon asked, peering ahead as if partaking in a sight test, but wearing a cheeky grin on the edge of his lips. I jumped and swore under my breath, which caused him to offer an incongruous chuckle. I didn't like it, and I didn't like him. I loved him, sure, but at the present, I didn't like him. Just feel a bit uneasy is all, I answered, trying to sound casual but cautious. I know it must have been conkers, but just scary, wasn't it? Maybe it wasn't conkers at all, he replied, letting the sentence linger like an atmospheric prologue. Go on. I didn't want to entertain whatever he was getting at, however. I liked the conversation. I liked the sound of his voice, cool and relaxed, trusting that there was nothing ill afoot. So, you'll probably get told about it by my dad, if I'm not attacked on the spot for lacking the extra X in my chromosomes. That's going to be fine, he said, sharp but not unkindly. Then why didn't you say anything beforehand? It won't be an issue. He gave a little puff of frustration from his nostrils, and so I leant back, realizing that I could press it, knowing that I had the moral high ground, and could push for an easy win in a bickering match, but didn't quite think this was the time for it. I made a note to archive it for the next time I mess up. Go on, I opted for. What will your dad probably tell me? Well, he said, his voice low, excited, foreboding. This little forest of ours isn't just known for its old hiking trail. If anything, it's more known for the fact not many people hike here at all anymore. This was it. He was finally going to tell me about all the negativity that had cropped and bloomed somewhere within these very trees. Even if not these ones that were swimming past our car, their cousins, their kin, somewhere in the vast distance. It's actually quite famous for disappearances, for strange sightings, for losing friends and bizarre, unearthly sounds in the distance. As if on cue, we heard the mocking laughter of the bird call that followed us earlier. Harrowing, penetrating, my skin tumbled into a mess of goose pimples, and the hairs on the nape of my neck stood on end. It sounded as if it was right above us, listening, spying, taunting. Brandon laughed. Just like that. He seemed almost happy that the forest was building atmosphere. What kind of disappearances? I asked, already knowing half of the answer. But what I'd read in A Sleepless Night, he could only augment and embellish. His family had more or less grown up with visits to this forest. They owned real estate of some form within the very nightmare of trees. Oh, just the usual, a nonchalant shrug of the shoulders. Groups of hikers coming out with a smaller party than they entered with. Thrill seekers spending a night only to have it be their last. Groups of teenagers stumbling upon bodies, the sounds of screams in the distance, the howls of wolves that are never seen. All forests have their ghost stories, their folklore and legends, but none are as infamous as this. The words drifted about the car for a moment, seeming to echo in the chamber of darkness created by the grasping, groping, gripping suffocation forced on us by the contracting wild wood without. I knew he was only trying to scare me, and I found a solace in that, in a strange, desperate way, a beggar would cry in delight at a molded morsel. If he was comfortable enough to joke about it, perhaps that meant I could relax in the joke, rather than stress in the content. And what about the skinwalkers? I asked. The words slipped from me without a second thought, but as soon as they joined the drift of his words, I realized it was the wrong thing to say. He slammed down on the brake, though we were going slow. The spontaneity of it shocked me. His jaw clenched, his lips a thin, tight line. He was glaring ahead, as if twisted with anger, and I watched as he waited for the mood to settle, the face to soften, for the controlling calm. "What did you say?" He turned to me, somewhere between expectant and vehement. I could feel little tendrils of panic unfurling in my gut, unspooling and constricting about my emotions. "The skinwalkers," and quickly in a masterful feign. "I think they're called. Like witches or something," a well-placed shrug and shake of the head. "Aren't they supposed to be an old legend in Utah? I think I read it somewhere." Brandon searched me for a moment, as if trying to read the lies I'd hidden in the words, trying to discern which was knowledge and which was pretend. He glanced about the car, did a quick search of all the windows, then, "Listen, there was no humor, no pretense, no atmosphere other than stern, strict, direct importance. Don't mention that word around my family, okay?" I was frozen, eyes locked in his. Eyes that I could usually read within a flash of a second, whether they wanted a hug, or were tired, or were hungry, or wanted to be alone for a while. Eyes that I'd only need a glance at to read a novel, a saga, but right now, nothing. They were steely, they were guarded, they were sincere. They were his eyes, not my boyfriend's. I was saved by answering, because he kept hold of the conversational torch and carried on. "Sorry, I didn't mean to sound so, intense." A forced smile, a sudden relaxing of the muscles, making me realize every inch of him was rigid. "It's just, ugh." He checked around the car one more time, and with a few heavy breaths, a few tonal missteps that were clearly a false start on a difficult sentence. "When we used to go here, it was with my cousins. My uncle, he died when I was around 10, 11. "I'm sorry," I interjected instinctively. I'd never heard this before, never heard of an uncle, never mind the loss of one. But my voice was ignored, or rather, tacitly acknowledged. So we used to take my aunt and my cousins into the woods with us. My dad would generally help her out financially, keep her afloat at Christmas, give her money on their birthdays and whatnot. But out here was always the best thing for her." He reached down to check his phone, as if worried it may have somehow been connected to his parents, and they were listening in on him. There were no messages on there, and I couldn't help but see there were no bars of signal either. That unsettled me as much as I knew this story was going to. She always seemed really relaxed here. Away from her job, getting help with the kids though, that was more down to my sister and me keeping them occupied, then my parents helping to look after them. But I don't know, I guess he or she liked the peace, the tranquility, the soothing spirit of nature. Where? I thought. I could see neither of these traits he so blindly offered, only claustrophobia, shadows, threats. And one night, we all heard a thudding at the door. Screaming, but there was no sound to it, just hollow, empty, primal screaming. I remember hearing my mom shouting for my dad to go check. That was what initially woke me up, then the screaming itself. He shivered from his words, from the memory they heralded. My mom came to our room, saw that we were awake. We, being the 4 kids, we slept together, usually telling ghost stories until early morning and eating endless sweets. A smile took over then, a fleeting, sweet, fading smile. We huddled together as my mom stood in the doorway. She was panicking. My dad was shouting to whoever was trying to get in. We were all crying in the horror and confusion. I can still see it now, clear as day, as my dad in his little padded night clothes. It was the mid-autumn. It gets cold walking past the door as a darkened silhouette. The boomstick, as we called it, his shotgun, held in front of him. My cousin started shouting for their mom. My aunt usually slept in the far room, because she loved the sun waking her up, but she wasn't answering. I could tell my mom wanted to run and check on her, but she refused to turn heel and leave us from sight. We, even then, must have been around 14 maybe. We knew that others had been in the cabin whenever we visited. We were told as much after hounding my mom why we had to wait in the car for Dad to check the cabin. My throat was tight, the knot in my stomach tighter still, a vice grip of fear that had bolstered those unfurling tendrils and armored them in scorching steel. They had hold of me, and my uneasiness of the forest had waned. Because I was in this story, I was there, I was scared. The screaming continued, the banging getting louder, more desperate, and my dad barreled down the stairs, threatening the intruders, saying he's got a shotgun and a pistol, and then his thundering footsteps faded. He swallowed his emotions 3 times, and his eyes glowed with a glisten, then a trickle. What was it? My aunt. That threw me off. What? My mouth was agape. I was nonplussed. Without getting into too much detail, she was erratic, panicked, and a shudder. There was some sort of scuffle, and my dad brought her up the stairs, calling her name, yelling at her to calm down, not angry yelling, but desperate, soothing, commanding yelling. She was screaming still, panicked and sobbing, and just sounds I've never even heard, never even thought could be possible were spilling out of her. Snarls and retching and begging and just another shudder, as if trying to shed the flaking husk of memory. My mom's face all but confirmed that something awful had happened, and she closed the door on us, demanded that we don't leave the room in a tone I've never heard her use before. We didn't see her, which I realized why after, but of course all 4 of us were at the door. My cousins were trying to open it, calling after their mom, but mine had locked the door. My sister and I had pushed our ears against the door, trying to listen, trying to grasp what the hell had happened. It went from the threat of an intruder to the panic of my aunt's safety. When the insane screaming and panicking quelled a little, and I mean fractionally, we managed to pluck out some words from the garble. And she kept repeating, "David, David. I saw him, he was out there." He paused, looking around the outside of the car once more, as if waiting for something, but there was nothing. Just the echo of furious silence, broken here and there by a distant twittering, a closer call, but thankfully not mocking laughter. It was horrible. She was terrified, not like horror movie gasp and scream terrified, but I don't know, like escaped from the depths of hell terrified. She kept shouting that he was there. He was calling to her from the window. He was begging for her to join him for a walk and all sorts. As if he was just standing there, from beyond the grave, in the quiet night air, a solo figure, ghastly alone, barely visible in the pale moonlight, calling, beckoning, urging. And I began to ask, already knowing the answer but needing it confirmed. "Who's David?" He lingered with a grave and terrible look. "Her husband." "Jesus Christ, Brandon," I muttered. "Well," he said finally, "the next day the Rangers were called, and there was a flurry of activity. Police had come, Rangers visited, blah blah blah. But when we got out of the room, we saw my mom sitting over her bed, with a soft crooning, nurturing voice which was swallowed by, David was there. But it was, I thought, not David Skinwalker, not David. Once more, the deep, piercing hysterical laughter boomed above us. Whatever bird that belonged to was evil, cruel, demonic. I didn't care if this was its home. It was a twisted creature, and I despised it. What happened to her? Well, he said, with an air of sorrow, I'd only seen her twice since. She went to a home. Basically an asylum, but for people with money. Her face, well, everywhere there was flesh was covered in a mess of crisscrossing scars. They were old, now healed, but they claimed every millimeter of flesh, like a fleshy, bright pink carpet of grass on her skin. We were told not to say anything, ask anything about it, told not to mention the woods, the nature, the cabin, nothing. She was stable, she was chatting to us, but she had developed a tick, a little twitch in which she'd check the corners of the room, then behind her every now and then. I overheard my mom and dad saying she had been on a lot of pills since, and I knew that whatever happened that night, the breakdown and the scars happened since then. And what did happen? We don't know, he admitted, simply, frustratingly simply, as if that tied the loose ends of something so traumatic. Apparently she didn't handle the loss well, as in, she didn't really respond to it. She accepted the help, she was grateful for it, but she just kept chugging along. Mom said it was the grief finally catching up to her. Dad said it was a mental breakdown. The story has been linked to the forest, probably by the old rangers, and now it's some strange story of how a woman was chased by her husband, who was a werewolf in some, skinwalker in others, murderer, sociopath, psychopath, whatever you can think of. But me, I don't know. A breakdown is one thing, grief is another. The way I heard her that night. It didn't seem natural. That was beyond fear. That was Jesus, that was enough to stop us going here for a while. At least, not without a lot more to protect us. Not without more security on the cabin. And we don't leave a single window open, curtain undrawn at night anymore. He added quickly, we don't believe it, of course. But still, peace of mind is worth closing a curtain, isn't it? I suppose it is. S'mores. Cute stories. Rustic fireplace. Fresh forest wind. Stroking the dog. Reading the book. Squirrel spotting. Bird spotting. Sunshine waking us. I had to remind myself of why the hell I was in this car in this forest. The stories were scary. The stories were unsettling and had burrowed, took root, tainted with their imaginative blight. But Brandon's own family. I jumped as the car began to roll again. Slowly, willingly, shockingly deeper into the depth of this cursed place. My God, I thought. I just want to reverse. I don't want insane ants, dirty fingers on the roof, banging. The fact that this place had literally been where actual, real-life bodies had been found was enough. I didn't need mysticism and zombie husbands added. No, I'd just make sure I knew where the guns rested. I'd stay in the clearings. I'd stay attached to Brandon. I won't walk into the forest, especially not at night. I'd definitely not enjoy this nature trip. But if I made a good impression, if I made Brandon happy, he invited me, even if I didn't forgive him for it, we can go home, get on with our lives, and I'd just never come again. I'll book a trip home to see my own family, without a cabin in the forest, without ants lost to lunacy, without buzzwords that cause cars to slam silent in the middle of the wilderness. But the car went on, slowly torturous, an antithesis to my speeding thoughts. I couldn't see the path at all anymore, only that it seemed to be where a trunk was not. Outside the car was silent, inside the car was silent. Brandon was lost in his horrible memories, and I was drowning in their retelling. Please, he said after a while, anything else we can joke about. My dad will tell stories about all sorts of random shit. But don't mention ski. One more involuntary shiver. Those. I won't, I promised, and I meant it. I didn't want to learn more. I knew too much already. It was my own fault for reading into this. If I just went along as a dutiful little boyfriend, my only stress would have been making a good impression. I had tainted this with my own need for self-sabotage. "Ah," he gasped after a few seconds. I gripped at the edge of the seat, suddenly lost in my heart of fear. There. I looked ahead and could see, almost tucked away by the drooping, hanging, heavy boughs, the shimmering of something metal reflective. We got closer, and I saw that it was a car. "That's the end of the road," he said, suddenly chirpy, as if trying to make sure the walk to the cabin wasn't one of dread and David. David. Not David. Skinwalker. 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 I shuddered this time. We got out the car, feeling the chill of the forest kissing at our flesh, tussling our hair, tugging at our clothes. It felt somehow like it was urging us backward, almost as if whispering with each electric gust that fought through the trees, "Leave. Go. Return." He went to the back, and I was happy to see he had hold of the pistol as he moved around to the trunk. He called to me, startling me from my trance into the muted horizon of shadow ahead, and I went to join him, collecting my bags, my stuff, the things I bought back at home, in civilization, in comfort, in romance. They seemed like an orange jumpsuit now, the last offers of dignity as I was thrown into prison. My cell, this forest forced to stay put, but instead of iron bars, it was black, brown, dark trees dressed in furry moss and skittering bugs. We locked up and began to walk on. Though I gave one last, longing look at the car, and on the roof, though slightly muted by the lack of sunlight, I could make out a strange figure that looked to be an unnaturally large bird. A hawk, a falcon, an eagle, a something. It loosed one great terrible cackle, and I snapped my head around, grasping onto Brandon's free hand, and thanking with every fiber of my being that the other was clasping a pistol. On we walked, and every single step weighed on my conscience, on my terror, on my discomfort. I had no idea what I was walking into, but I didn't like it one bit. "Just an hour's walk," Brandon said, "and then we're golden." But until then, we weren't. We were swallowed by the forest, we were shadowed, we were nothing but prey. I built a cabin on a child's grave. If you're into DIY cabin build videos, you've probably seen me on YouTube. I'm a guy who likes to build things in the middle of nowhere from scratch. The land I bought for my third cabin was incredibly cheap, about $15,000 for 3 acres in the Minnesotan wilderness. But man, was it a son of a bitch to get to. Accessed by old unserviced logging roads many, many miles from civilization. That's parts of what drew me to it, I guess. It took me the best part of 2 days and 3 round trips with the pickup and trailer to haul all the materials up there. The plan was to camp on site for a month during the build, without having to do any more return trips. The site was beautiful, a clearing in the woods, with a gently flowing river passing through the back of the property. I could wash, drink, and fish that river. As with any build, I started with a foundation. Clearing shrubs, marking out the footprint with string, and then digging 3-foot holes for the corner posts. As I was filming all this, it was slow work, and I was already 8 days into the project when I finally had the foundation completed. That's when the man came. I was in the river washing my hair. I had plunged my head into the cold water to rinse off the soap. As I emerged, he was standing right there at the river's edge. A heavily bearded man that looked like he'd been out in the bush a little too long. I know it's a cliché, but he had a slightly crazed look in his eyes. A rush of emotions passed over me, a bit of shock, a bit of fear. Being so remote, it's very unexpected to be stumbled upon by another human. On top of that, I was naked. I still managed a greeting, and he nodded in return. He asked me if I was building a cabin, and I said I was. I asked what brought him there, and he said that's what he came to talk to me about. I suggested I get dressed and I could make us some coffee. He tipped his hat, but did not look away as I timidly exited the lake in all my naked glory. As the coffee brewed, he stood staring at my work on the foundation. "We used to own this land," he said. "Me and my wife, but we had to sell it. We still visit once a year on our child's birthday." "Are your wife and child with you now?" I asked. "My wife is camped down the road, cooking dinner." "Is it your truck broken down back there?" I had bent the axle going too fast over a ditch and have since been unable to move it. I nodded. He took a moment before carrying on. My child is right here, buried in the center of your foundation. I tipped the coffee I was pouring onto my jeans. I'm so sorry, I muttered. The man cleared some grass in the center of my foundation, and sure enough a sun-faded wooden cross lay there. After the man had gone, I had a lot of thinking to do. I lay in my tent mindlessly reviewing my camera footage from the last few days of construction. The generator was humming softly outside while powering my laptop. The man had asked me to move my cabin, but doing so would put me way behind schedule, and I had to be back at work in a month. Also, that was the only flat and treeless part of land on my plot. I hadn't brought the tools for felling large trees. As I lay there scrubbing through the footage, I realized the camera must have been left on while I was bathing. It has been aimed at a log I had been sawing before taking a break to wash, and the man had passed right through the frame. The screwed up thing was he wasn't alone. A woman was with him. Why would he lie? Did they see that I was bathing so his wife headed back to their camp? I scrubbed back through the shot. I didn't see him or the woman pass through frame again. I was interrupted then by some scuffling outside my tent. At first I was alarmed, but then realized it was probably Tufty, the fox I had befriended through feeding him my leftovers. I unzipped the window and sure enough Tufty was licking my plate clean. I didn't sleep well that night, my mind reeling about the grave and nightmares of the man and his wife, watching me bathe in the river. The next day I decided to continue with the build. This was my land now. If the man returned, I would let him move the grave, so I continued working 12 hours a day to stay on schedule, only taking a break to eat and occasionally cool down in the river. And 5 days later he returned. The sun was setting as I sat outside my tent. I was filming an outdoor cooking segment for the channel. Beans, sausage, and wild mushrooms on the camp stove. He was not so friendly this time. Eyeing my cabin, he could see I had not moved my foundation, and I had now laid the floor joists and decking. He didn't even say hello. He stood there glaring at me for a minute, and then made a show of spitting at the ground beside me, before storming back down the trail, a hatchet tucked in the back of his belt. By this point, I felt a little relieved. He was understandably upset, but hopefully I had seen the last of him and could continue with my project in peace. My mood improved greatly when Tufty later turned up and shared some of my sausages. The days ticked by with little to note. Raising the first wall of a cabin is always a big moment. Doing it alone is tough, but through practice you work out methods of lifting and holding the heavy wall sections into place. I raised 2 walls that day and was feeling pretty good about it. It was another hot June day, and I went to collect some cool drinking water from the river. As I approached the water's edge, I could smell something pretty bad. If you've ever smelled death before, you'll know it's instantly recognizable. The flies led me to it, and soon tears were streaming down my face. It was Tufty's body, rotting in the reeds, his head separated clean from his neck. I almost threw up in the river, but could only dry heave. Then quickly I looked around, wondering when the man had been here. I searched for clues in the mud, but found none. I was both scared and angry. Part of me wanted to go find the man's camp and knock him down for what he'd done. I no longer felt safe here, but my truck was broke, and I had not yet come up with a plan to get out. I slept that night with my axe in my tent. I had also rigged the camera outside the tent facing towards the cabin and the trail beyond it. I could monitor the recording from my laptop inside my tent, a makeshift security camera that had pretty good night vision. What little sleep I got was plagued with visions of Tufty's death and a young child's laughter. The next day I packed up at 5 a.m. I carried only the essentials in a rucksack. Everything else I battened down under a tarp, the generator and all my tools, etc. I didn't know when I'd be back. I took my camera with me, a rough plan forming in my head as I headed down the trail to the logging road. When I got to my truck, I saw the tires had been slashed. It didn't matter anyways as the axle was broke, but I filmed the tires as evidence. I continued down the road looking for fresh tire tracks in the mud. It wasn't long until I found them. They turned off into the backcountry, and I followed them for 15 minutes until the man's camp was in sight through the trees. White smoke raising up from a fire. His old truck was there, parked about 100 yards outside his camp. I looked in the window. The keys were left there in the ignition, a common practice of rural living. I crept closer to his camp, keeping myself hidden, camera in hand. About 50 yards out, I saw him, cooking breakfast over the fire. I needed to get closer. Having a fixed lens, I could not zoom in, and I wanted more evidence to take to the police. I got so close I could smell him. He was due a wash. A tree with a mossy base allowed me to settle and hold my camera steady without making a noise. I barely took a breath due to the fear that gripped me now, an icy cold feeling passing over my whole body. The man was crying, talking to himself as he cried. I could hear every word, and he was clearly alone, no wife to be seen. After a couple minutes, I panned the camera around his camp and saw a stump where he had done it. A hatchet lay there, bloody, Tufty's fur and blood. I had seen enough and crept back towards his truck. I hopped in and turned the key in the ignition. It turned over but didn't start. I looked behind. The man had heard and jumped up from his seat. I turned the key again, no joy. The man was running towards me now. His speed incredibly fast and efficient through the bush. I had one last chance at this and jammed my foot into the gas as I turned the key again. She coughed to life, and I slammed her in drive, almost breaking the lever. The man was just feet away, but the tires caught traction, and I floored it through the bush. I believe he got close enough to touch the truck, but as I finally swerved back onto the logging, I had created a safe gap between us. I drove 2 hours to the nearest town. I was starved, so I pulled into the only cafe to get some breakfast. After ordering the pancakes with bacon, I asked the owner where the police station was. He said it didn't open for another hour on Sundays. It's funny how when you're living out in the woods, you stop keeping track which day of the week it is. While I ate, I prepared my video evidence to show the police. I needed a clear image of the man and remembered on his second visit, he stood in front of my camera while I was cooking. It took a while to find the clip, but when I did, I almost choked on my hot cakes. As the man spat at me, his wife stood next to him, clear as day. She was pale, long black hair, and wore a lobotomized expression as she stared off camera towards my cabin. Then she crouched down, and a small, pale child ran into her arms. As the man turned to leave, they left with him. I then got the idea to look at the night footage from when I set up the camera for security. I fast-forwarded through hours of darkness, and then the little girl suddenly appeared again, skipping around my campsite in a white dress. I was now shaking with fear, but still I managed to load up the footage from today at the man's camp. And there they were again, mother and child right there by the fire. I could hear them now as well. I turned up the volume on my laptop, the voices just audible over the crackling of the fire. "Daddy, how did I die?" The child asked your mother. "She did it," he said. "Why?" "I don't know. I guess she was hungry," he said through his tears. The child turned her head towards her mother, revealing half of her face had been chewed away. "How did Mom die?" "I killed her," said the man, "for what she did to you." Thanks for listening. If you like our work, do subscribe because your support helps us keep this channel alive.